Melanie, the YouTube is started, so you can get started.
Here, are we recording?
Yes, I'm gonna hit the record button now.
I was printing. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope everybody was able to have a good lunch. We're going to start our next session, which is affordable, accessible housing for people with disabilities. My name is Melanie Washington, and I'll be facilitating this session. We have 4 panelists for this session, and so I am going to read their bios, and as I read your bio, I want you to turn your camera on so people can see who you are, and then turn them off as I move to the next person. I'm going to start with Gordon Levine. Gordon has worked for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, managing Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, Louisiana's largest coalition to end homelessness since 2017. But before moving to Louisiana, he administered several federally funded programs for the state of Wisconsin, including HUD's Emergency Solutions Grant and Home Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Program, and SAMHSA's projects for assistance in transition from homelessness, which is the PATH program. He is a primary architect of the Louisiana's response to homelessness during the COVID-19 emergency, including developing the state's 3-part response model. He lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana with his family, including 2 small dogs and a dozen of bonsai trees. Hello, Gordon. Next, I will introduce Amate Heller. Amate Heller has been a staff attorney with the Disability Rights Louisiana since 2015. Amate, if you can turn on your video. No, it won't turn on. Bambi, you may have to give him permission to turn on his video. There it is. His practice focuses on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Medicaid Act, and the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities in Louisiana. He has been lead counsel on numerous civil rights suits, including the recently settled AJ versus Gee, a class action guaranteeing the provision of in-home nursing services to children with severe disabilities. He has been a presenter at a number of conferences, including the Health Advocates Conference and the National Disability Rights Network's annual conference. Prior to entering the legal field, Amate worked as an urban planner and as a tenant organizer in his hometown of San Francisco. Amate has devoted his life to the pursuit of social justice, the rights of marginalized populations, and the dignity of working people. And Amate, am I saying your name correctly?
Amitai, but that's close. I never really correct people, so.
Amitai, okay, thank you. Okay. Next, we have Sharon Hennessy. Sharon is a self-advocate and longtime advocate for individuals with disabilities. Ms. Hennessy graduated from the University of New Orleans with a Master's of Education degree in Special Education, Habilitative Services, and has received specialized training in many areas during her 30 years of work experience in the disability community. She has conducted workshops in disability sensitivity and awareness, accessibility, employment, work and benefits analysis, fair housing, affordable and accessible housing, the ABLE Act, the Disability Integration Act, was a self-advocate and self-determination, well as self-advocacy and self-determination. Ms. Hennessy is currently the director of People First of Louisiana, a statewide self-advocacy organization made up of people with disabilities. Thank you. Ms. Hennessy. Last but not least, we have Renee Corrigan. Renee has worked with LAFHAC, LAFAC, since 2015 and currently serves as the Education and Outreach Coordinator. She conducts fair housing trainings for a variety of audiences throughout Louisiana and works with teachers and administrators to engage children and youth in conversation about fairness, justice, and equity through LAFAC's Fair Housing 5 programs. Before joining LAFHAC, because I don't know if I should be saying LAFAC, Renee was...
And that's the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center.
Okay. Renee was the education coordinator for the New Orleans affiliate of the National Alliance of Mental Illness. She also conducts Undoing Racism workshops with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Thank you, Renee. So now we will move into short presentations, and we'll be starting off with Gordon.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction. My video appears to be frozen, at least on my end. There, very good, there it goes. So my scope is relatively narrower than everyone else's, and so I'm gonna try and keep it focused on really what I'm able to talk about and what I do. So I work for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, and for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, I manage the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is Louisiana's largest coalition to end homelessness. So if you live or work in Baton Rouge or Lake Charles or Houma or any of their surrounding parishes or Natchitoches, Sabine or Plaquemines and St. Bernard, you fall in my catchment area. I'm one of several continuum of care managers across the state. I'm focused in Baton Rouge because, of course, that's my largest municipal area, but we provide services to more than half of the state's total geography. So ultimately, I'm here to kind of answer three questions. How can people access shelter during COVID-19? How can people experiencing homelessness with disabilities access federally funded services in general? And how can organizations that want to provide services to people experiencing homelessness, including people with disabilities, successfully apply for federal funding? And I want to take that from sort of smallest to broadest. In terms of accessing shelter during COVID-19, Louisiana is in this, as it often has been, a leader in preventing and ending homelessness nationally. One of the things that I think we're all really sensitive to is that whenever there's a list of states ranked from 1 to 50 and something, Louisiana is often near the bottom of that list. But in terms of homelessness, we're near the top. We, since 2012, have reduced homelessness in Louisiana by 69% by creating additional shelters, by creating additional housing projects, but most significantly by creating a really strong permanent supportive housing program statewide that's enabled people who are experiencing chronic homelessness and who are living with disabilities to receive open-ended long-term vouchers and wraparound case management and supportive services, while also implementing a strong diversion program. Diversion in our case meaning a case management program designed to return people to housing via their friends, family, faith networks, etc., via mediation rather than by a public subsidy. So during COVID-19, we again are really at the forefront of national implementation of services for people experiencing homelessness. The last time that I checked for the Balance of State Continuum of Care, we start that sentence from a different place. Every year in January, we conduct a census, we and every other community in the country, of people experiencing literal homelessness and which means both sheltered and living on the streets or in another place not meant for human habitation. In January 2020, we counted 282 people, either single persons or people living in multi-person households. We counted 283 people. And as of last count this morning, we had created additional shelter beds and sheltered since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic 282 people. And so we've got pretty much 100% coverage in the majority of the state for shelter during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's fundamentally a response to our knowledge that experiencing unsheltered homelessness is itself a high risk factor for people who, for morbidity and mortality for COVID-19. People who are living on the streets don't have access to sanitary facilities, can't self-isolate, and are more likely to congregate. So, the upshot of all of that is that you may be aware or you may have some intuition that people who are experiencing homelessness are disproportionately likely to be living with either a physical or a mental or a developmental disability. And some of that that's a correlation in two directions. Some of that is because people who are living with disabilities are disproportionately likely to have additional housing barriers that could lead to homelessness. And some of it is because the condition of homelessness is necessarily and unfortunately a situation that is more likely to cause the occurrence of disabilities, especially mental disabilities. And I should say that as someone who is living with a severe and persistent mental disability. I was diagnosed with PTSD about 10 years ago. And so I'm very sensitive and very acutely aware of the ways in which homelessness can have an impact on a person's mind, body, and way of being in the world. And so how can a person get access to shelter during COVID-19? Happily, very few people are still experiencing unsheltered homelessness in most areas of the state. But should you in your professional career or personal life encounter someone who's experiencing homelessness, what we want you to do is to connect them with your local coordinated entry access point. Coordinated entry being our name in the homelessness world for a system whereby you can present at any one of a number of different locations, or present by phone, or present online, or present to an outreach worker and request housing and services, and then be connected to whatever is available, regardless of where you happen to present. And so the way to access services is to present at your local access point. There is a list of access points of all of the access points statewide at the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care's website at laboscoc.org. Now, it's very easy to find from there. There's a visual navigation, there's a text-based navigation, there's a tab-based navigation. It should be very accessible to anyone who needs to get a hold of it. And that's going to have phone numbers, that's going to have addresses, it'll have dates and times, etc. And then as part of that, we've stood up in most areas of the state what we would call non-congregate shelter, which is the sort of FEMA term for we've identified hotel rooms to rent for the short to medium duration for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, which again, that unfortunately has a significant overlap with people who are living with disabilities. So that's really the process there. The non-congregate shelter piece is really a short-term solution, and it's intended to be a short-term solution as additional funds from the CARES Act are being made available to states including Louisiana and to municipalities including Baton Rouge, Shreveport, New Orleans. We're standing up medium and longer-term housing options. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. That web address again is going to be the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care's website at laboscoc.org. That's laboscoc.org. And so ultimately, that's exactly the answer to my next question, which is how do people experiencing homelessness who are living with disabilities access federally funded services? It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. Go to a coordinated entry access point, explain that you're experiencing homelessness, and you'll be directed to the relevant level of services. And I want to both modulate expectations there, and give you an idea of what the real landscape is. Generally speaking, housing is not available on a first come first serve basis, but rather on the basis of acuity of need. Right. The reason we have homelessness is because there aren't enough resources to go around. There are, in fact, most of the time, not nearly enough resources to go around. And so when someone requests services, there's usually an escalating series of mediation conversations to try and divert the person back to housing without applying any kind of subsidy. But ultimately, if those are unsuccessful, a person, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, can really expect to receive at least access to non-congregate shelter, as the coverage for that is very close to 100% statewide. Finally, I want to talk about the long-term plan. So the short-term plan, as I said, is that we are getting as many people as possible who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness into non-congregate shelter. Everybody else is in traditional shelter or congregate shelter. And so as a result of that, we've come very close to ending unsheltered homelessness, at least in advance of any eviction wave that might be coming in Louisiana. So the medium-term goal there is to move people from shelter, which isn't housing, but is a temporary place, is by definition a temporary place, and into permanent housing through a program model that's fundamentally called rapid rehousing, which is a medium-term federally funded voucher that could last anywhere from a month to 2 years. And it comes with case management and wraparound services and so on. But ultimately, what we know is that when a person is experiencing chronic homelessness and living with a severe and persistent disability of any kind, 2 years is often not enough to achieve self-sufficiency. 10 years is often not enough. And so we have this longer-term model called permanent supportive housing, which is an unlimited duration subsidy with case management and supportive services. It is reserved exclusively for people experiencing chronic homelessness who are living with a disability. And it's really intended to ensure that people who need assistance in a consistent and ongoing way, who really can't be expected to go out and earn a sustainable living wage at this point in their life, or in a consistent way, can live independently and successfully with a level of support that they need that's tailored to their individual and specific housing barriers. And so organizations that are interested in providing either the housing or the services component of that, we expect the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the primary funder of services here in Louisiana, to make available additional dollars for PSH in the very near future. In any other year, those dollars would already be available, and your COC managers statewide would be banging down your doors and asking you to apply. The money isn't there yet. We expect it to be there very soon. Historically, our applications have been due by the end of September. There may be a little flexibility about that there. But ultimately, if you're an organization interested in providing housing or services to people experiencing homelessness, I would urge you to contact your local continuum of care and get on their radar as someone that's interested in applying so that they can hook you in with announcements and other resources. The best way to do that is to go again to laboscoc.org, look up one of those coordinated entry access points, call them, and explain that you're looking not for services, but to contact the local continuum of care. And they'll put you in contact with the person in question. If that's too much effort, though, you can go to that same website, go to the contact page. My information and my staff's information is there. Reach out to me. Let me know what area of the state you operate in, and I'll make sure that you're connected with the right person. So that's about as briefly as I've ever spoken in my life. So I'm going to go ahead. I recognize that I've got 6 minutes left on my initial docket. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here, take any questions, and then relinquish the microphone.
Well, you did a great job, and that was a lot of good information. It looks as if we do not have any questions in the chat. So,
Okay, very good. Well, then I appreciate all of your time, and I wish you the joy of a conference and a good weekend.
thank you so much. You do the same.
Gordon, this is Bambi. Can you stay on in case there's questions towards the end?
Sure, I'd be very happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So next we will have Renee with LAFHAC.
Yeah, thank you so much. LAFAC, or the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I had some trouble with my microphone a little earlier.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'm just going to give some basics of fair housing overall. And then Amitai mentioned that he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about some current issues. I will mention some ways that fair housing applies in a COVID situation. And then I'll be open for questions after that. So we're a private nonprofit civil rights organization, the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. We fight housing discrimination all across the state of Louisiana. We have 4 different departments that do that. So the first is our enforcement department, and that's made up of our attorneys and investigators. If you think you've experienced housing discrimination, you call them, they'll investigate the complaint. If they find good evidence, they'll then represent you free of charge in state or federal court, or to file a complaint with HUD. And just a note, I'm not an attorney, and nothing I say today is legal advice, but we absolutely do have attorneys on staff who are happy to talk with you. And so please, you're welcome to call our office if you have any specific questions. Our enforcement department also conducts investigations using mystery shoppers. A lot of people think that housing discrimination, it's something that used to happen way back when. It doesn't happen anymore. But our investigations show that housing discrimination is still incredibly prevalent all throughout our community. A lot of different types of discrimination are happening every day. We are always looking for mystery shoppers. If you know anyone who's interested in working with our team, it's a very, very part-time job, but it is paid. Right now, during the COVID pandemic, it's being done virtually. And it's a great way for someone to make a little bit of extra money and support civil rights work in the community. You can get more information on our website, lafairhousing.org, and I'll put that in the chat. We also have a homeownership protection program, which helps people prevent foreclosure. And we have an education and outreach department that I direct. So if you know of any organizations or groups that would like to get a Know Your Rights training about fair housing, or housing providers who would like that training, you can always call our office and we're happy to provide that. And then we have a policy department. So we work for policies at the local, state, and federal level, make housing more fair and accessible for everyone. So some wins we've had: several years ago, we got a law passed in Louisiana that protects the housing rights of survivors of domestic violence. Recently, we also were able to win some security deposit reform. And right now we're working really hard to advocate for protections and support for renters to stop the coming eviction crisis that we're staring down right now due to the COVID-19 disaster. If you want to get involved and support that work, I really hope that you do. Go ahead and sign up for our email list at lafairhousing.org. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. So, fair housing basics. A lot of the work that we do is enforcing a law called the Fair Housing Act, which was signed on April 11th, 1968, exactly 1 week after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it was one of the most important achievements of the civil rights movement. It applies to pretty much any housing transaction you can think of. So that includes rentals, sales, insurance, lending, advertising, harassment, and zoning. Lots of different types of housing transactions. And it applies to a lot of different kinds of housing. So, homes, single-family homes, apartments, condos. It can also apply to nursing homes, dormitories. It can also often apply to homeless shelters as well. Not all the time, but often. There are 7 what's called protected classes. So that's groups of people, and it's illegal to discriminate against someone based on that basis. And so those protected classes are race, color, religion, and national origin. Those were all added in 1968 when the law was originally passed. Sex was added in 1974. And then family status, which is having children, either your biological children, adopted children, children that you're in the process of getting custody of, or being pregnant. You can't be discriminated against based on that basis. And that was added to the law in 1988. And then disability was also added in 1988. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally protected classes, but often discrimination based on those things can be considered illegal discrimination on the basis of sex. And so if you ever encounter someone, or if you experience discrimination because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, please do call our office. There are also federal protected classes anywhere you go in the United States. There are also state protected classes, which are identical. And then there are some local protections in New Orleans and in Shreveport. A really important part of fair housing law is that a policy that has a disparate impact on protected class members can violate the law, even if that's not the intent. So in addition to those protected classes, there are other groups of people who do have some fair housing protections. So it's important for you to know about that as well. So for example, if there's a policy that consistently harms survivors of domestic violence, like a zero tolerance policy that says that anyone who is part of domestic violence, whether the perpetrator or the survivor gets evicted, that policy is going to consistently, reliably unfairly impact people based on sex, because women are more likely to be survivors of domestic violence. And so that policy will also likely violate the law. Similarly, a policy that screens out anyone who has a criminal background, anyone who has criminal justice involvement. Having a criminal background is not a protected class, but consistently over time, that policy is going to have an unfair impact based on race because of the way that African Americans are overly targeted by our criminal justice system. And so people who have a criminal background also do have some protection under fair housing law. If you ever have a question about that, if you ever think you're being treated unfairly based on anything, it's worth it to give us a call so we can look a little bit more at that issue. So when it comes to disability discrimination complaints make up more than half of all fair housing complaints that come in across the country. And so it's really important to understand how fair housing relates to disability. Disability is defined really broadly under the Fair Housing Act. It's any sort of physical, mental, or emotional condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that could be a whole lot of different things. I see a question in the chat. A developmental disability and acquired disability. Oh, that's a question about supported housing. So I guess Mr. Lynn will answer that question. Great, thank you. But under the Fair Housing Act, so again, a lot of different conditions can fall under this. So it could be various physical disabilities. It could include mental or emotional disabilities like PTSD, depression, autism. It could include a history of substance abuse and addiction, being HIV positive, diabetes, heart disease, lots of different things could qualify as a disability under the Fair Housing Act. Someone with a disability may encounter a whole lot of different types of discrimination. So I mentioned those different transactions. We see disability discrimination in all of those different transactions. So for example, when you're trying to rent a home or rent an apartment, we often see steering. Steering is when a housing provider limits your options based on who you are and their assumptions about what you need and what's appropriate for you. So for example, if you are going to look at an apartment complex and the housing provider sees that you walk with some sort of assisted device, or they see that you have a physical disability and they only show you homes on the first floor. They only show you apartments on the first floor. They don't offer you all the units. That's illegal disability discrimination. Your options have been limited based on someone else's assumptions and discrimination, not on what you've wanted. We've also found another type of discrimination that happens in rentals is when people who are deaf or hard of hearing try and communicate using video relay interpreting, and the housing provider hangs up on them. This happens all the time. The housing provider doesn't know, they don't have the patience, they don't pay attention, and they're shutting out people who are deaf from their properties. That would be illegal disability discrimination. We've also found a lot of folks who are in nursing home settings and are not allowed, not provided an interpreter or other means of communication. And that can have really, really dire consequences. And again, a nursing home can qualify as housing under the Fair Housing Act. And so if that ever happens to anyone here or your clients, we definitely want to know about that. We've also had complaints of people with disabilities who receive disability income from the Social Security Administration, having that income treated differently when they're trying to qualify for a mortgage than earned income. And so that could be illegal disability discrimination. Other things that we've seen, zoning regulations and requirements that prevent the siting of group homes in certain communities for a variety of different discriminatory reasons. And then harassment based on a disability, for example, because of HIV positive status or a perceived disability like a mental illness. All of those things can violate the Fair Housing Act. Something that's also important to know about is that, like in other contexts, when it comes to housing, people with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations, which are physical changes like adding a ramp, grab bars, a doorbell that flashes a light instead of making a sound, widening doorways, lowering light switches, all those sorts of modifications. As long as that's reasonable and necessary for their enjoyment of the home, people with disabilities are entitled to those modifications. We do get a lot of questions about who pays for it. Generally, it's going to be the person, the tenant, the person with the disability has to pay for it unless it's some sorts of federally funded housing. The other thing that people with disabilities are entitled to in their housing are accommodations. So that's a change in a policy or a procedure that the housing provider usually does. So for example, no pets policies are totally legal. Landlords can say no pets, they can say no cats, no dogs, they can say no animals under over a certain number of pounds, or no breed, they can have breed restrictions. But if somebody does need an animal because of a disability, so if they have an assistance animal, such as a service animal or an emotional support animal, then the housing provider does have to waive that no pets policy. They have to waive that breed restriction. They have to waive that size restriction. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to fair housing and disability is that buildings with 4 or more units that were built after 1991 are also required to meet 7 what are called design and construction requirements. And so those include just basic accessibility standards for things like doorways, common areas, and kitchens. And I'll say that briefly, several years ago, we did an investigation in the New Orleans area where we went into buildings that should have been in compliance. And we found that 100% of those buildings were failing on at least one basis, failing to meet these requirements, and 81% had at least 2 violations of this law. So a lot of our housing is not accessible in a lot of different reasons, and in a lot of cases, it's actually violating the law to not be accessible. This is a very quick overview. We have a ton of information on our website, lafairhousing.org, and you're also always welcome to call us if you have any questions at all.
Thank you so much, Renee.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon, can we get you to answer the question from the chat box? I'll read it for you. Is there any difference between having a developmental disability and an acquired disability later when it comes to a timeline for receiving supported housing?
Sure. So that's a great question. The definition of a disability is pretty broad, as I think we just touched on. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of accessing permanent supportive housing or any other federally funded housing for a person who is living with disabilities, what kind of disability it is, when you acquired that disability, or what disability category it's in. The only question that is, to my knowledge, ever asked for permanent supportive housing, and I believe that this is true for many other kinds of HUD subsidized housing as well, is on the night of intake to the project. So at the time that the project is doing their eligibility screening and making sure that you meet the homelessness definition, that you meet household size definition, etc., that at that time you have a signed letter from an authorized health provider that says, yes, this person has this specific disability. Doesn't matter when you got it, doesn't matter what it is, but you need someone who's licensed by the state who's willing to sign down and say, yes, this person is living with XYZ disability. And if it's all right, Melanie, I see that another question just came through. Does permanent supportive housing have a waiting list, or is it income-based? I'm going to try and answer that question briefly, though it's a big challenge, to be honest, as you're going to see. There really is no income test for it. So there's no income maximum or income cap for permanent supportive housing, or PSH. There are several reasons for that. The most important one being that we know that while income is a major component of why a person might be experiencing homelessness, it's not the only component, especially when we talk about people with severe and persistent disabilities. That's one thing. In terms of a waiting list, I think what you're thinking of is really Section 8, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is first come, first served, where they open a waiting list and you put in your name in the hat, and eventually you will be called. That's not how PSH or any of our homelessness programs work. Emergency shelter is first come, first served. There's no waiting list. You show up on the day and you get a bed. For everything else, including PSH, there's usually our coordinated entry process, and it differs from region to region in the state. But usually there's this process of progressive engagement where you show up, and on day one you're connected with shelter, and on day one they'll try to return you to housing via a problem-solving conversation, and over the next period of time they'll try to continue returning you to housing, and then ultimately you'll be assessed using an evidence-based tool to determine your level of need, to triage you in order of highest need to lowest need, and then ultimately the people with the highest need are going to be contacted first when beds come available. And the reason I mentioned beds becoming available is at any given time, pretty much all of our housing programs statewide are at or above 100% capacity. And so what that means ultimately is, while there is sort of a list that you go on while you're waiting, it's not a waiting list, there's a prioritization list. And someone who has a very high level of need is likely to get into a project very quickly, while a person who has a very low level of need, which usually does not include anyone who is living with a disability, will likely not ever be called or will not be contacted within any kind of short or medium term.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I was going to let have Renee answer a couple of questions, but I think just to make sure we're good on time, I'll let the next two people present and then we'll come back to questions. So with that being said, we'll have Amitai Keller.
Okay, great. So what I've been asked to talk about today, and what I think is important for people to know, is about evictions and people with disabilities' access to the courts right now during COVID. As was mentioned before, I'm an attorney working with Disability Rights Louisiana, and we've been working with a coalition of civil rights attorneys monitoring disability access to eviction courts. The team is a bunch of litigators and also some frontline attorneys who are monitoring the issue around the state. Frontline attorneys, I mean the attorneys who are actually in court from legal aid organizations defending against these evictions. And what we started hearing about once the eviction moratorium was winding down and people were starting to hear that they were getting evicted by their landlords, is that they were terrified, and rightfully so, to go to court because of their disabilities and the underlying comorbidities and their heightened risk of, very bad health outcomes if they contract COVID-19. And maybe prior to COVID-19, it wasn't a crisis for someone with hypertension to have to appear in court, but now it is. So COVID-19 has really highlighted the needs of people with disabilities to get access to housing court around the state. And it's also really shown us that generally there's been a lack of knowledge amongst judges about how the accommodations process works. And so we're trying to educate people and litigate if necessary. And by people, I mean judges and other attorneys, to be requesting accommodations and on behalf of their clients. And also, if you are a person with a disability who does not have access to a lawyer and you're being evicted, or you just have to go to court for some other reason, I just want to be very clear about this issue. You should not be getting evicted if it's too dangerous for you to be in court because of your disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act should provide you some sort of relief in that measure. That's not 100% rule, but really the way that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is constructed is to allow for an accommodations process for this exact time. And so the ADA absolutely applies to state courts, and it definitely applies to justices of the peace, who are the people who do the evictions in rural Louisiana and not so rural Louisiana and Jefferson Parish. And those people need to abide by the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a big case about this from the Supreme Court called Tennessee v. Lane. And what that case says is that one of the main reasons that the ADA was passed into law is because people were being excluded from courthouses because of their disabilities. And us civil rights attorneys and lots of people with disabilities are saying that this is a very similar situation to that. And what that case was about, the Supreme Court case, was about basically saying it's not enough just to have a court open. People with disabilities need to be able to actually access that court. They need to have meaningful access to the court. So just because you can theoretically crawl upstairs, if there's no wheelchair ramp, you're really being denied meaningful access. And we think that that would guarantee protections to people with disabilities who do not want to appear in court because of the danger possessed by COVID, based on guidance from the CDC and various epidemiologists from around the country, including ones that we've spoken to, who've been cautioning against people going to court. There's a governor's order stating that courts should not be proceeding in person when avoidable. I believe it is still currently in effect, although I'd have to check on that. So it is a little bit more about the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is considered to be discrimination for when someone with a disability is not provided equal opportunity to obtain the same result or to gain a benefit from an existing government program. The courts would be one of those government programs that we're talking about. So what the ADA also says is that courts have an affirmative obligation to make modifications to existing policies, practices, procedures, when such modifications are necessary to avoid discrimination based on disability. And there's some exceptions to that, such as fundamental alteration or an undue burden on the courts, but we don't think those, most of the time, those will not apply in this context. And I want to just distinguish here from something that Renee said about where the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act differs in the way that it treats accommodations or modifications. You know, if you need to make a modification to your house, your landlord might not necessarily have to pay for it, but the court does have a fiscal responsibility to pay for the creation of wheelchair ramps, things like that. And we think that would also apply to the accommodations that people need during COVID-19. And so when we think about what does it mean really to request an accommodation for an eviction court, and really for people with disabilities, they kind of need to think about that for themselves and tailor it individually to their specific needs. So there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach. But that being said, you know, some things that you might want to consider requesting would be a video conference if you have access to the internet, a continuation to come into court later, potentially a phone hearing, although we don't think that would allow for the best outcomes for people with disabilities. Possibly outdoor hearings, you know. So you should get creative. You should think about what's going to work for you, and you should contact an attorney on the matter if you are someone who is getting evicted and is scared to go to court because of COVID-19 on the basis of your disability. Or even if you don't have a disability, you probably have some rights as well. And I'll get into that in just a minute. So, you know, some judges are being really good about this issue. We've spoken to one judge in the 24th Judicial District Court, or a justice of the peace who's doing evictions in Jefferson Parish, who has been going out to low-income people's homes with a hotspot and a tablet so that they can have access to the courts. This is the level of accommodation that we are expecting to be available from other judges if people are being forced to face eviction proceedings in Louisiana. Of course, the CARES Act, which is about to expire, also provides some additional protections. I think it's an extension of a 30-day notice, but I'm not 100% positive on that. But there's a lot of primers on the CARES Act that you can look at to see if you have any further rights on that, although the law is set to expire. So we've been doing some outreach to different judges. We reached out to the Attorney General, who we understand has sent out a memorandum to all justices of the peace explaining the accommodations process and the rights of people with disabilities during coronavirus. We know that First and Second City Court in Orleans Parish, who do all the evictions for the parish, are sending out documents, two-page documents explaining people's rights to have accommodations. And generally what we're hearing is that judges are willing to work with people in Orleans to allow them to not have to come to court during this pandemic. We did have one case where a judge denied an accommodation in St. Helena Parish. And that case was a video conference was requested by a person with a disability, and the judge denied the request, saying that they had to come into court. And the case was appealed, and the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Baton Rouge remanded it, basically saying you have to give this person an accommodation. Now, they didn't rule on the basis of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what they said was that this should really apply to all people, and people should not be coming into court unnecessarily. And anyone can contact me with that question if you want to get more information about that case, and you need to use it possibly for one of your hearings. Again, also feel free to contact me if you're facing an eviction and you have a disability that requires an accommodation. Our agency does not do the eviction defense. That would be legal aid most likely, but we could certainly work with you potentially to get you the accommodations that you need so that you could have your day in court. And that also applies not just to evictions, but to other access to the court needs. So I'm going to leave it at that and answer any questions about evictions. That was kind of I was trying to kind of breeze through it, but if anyone has any targeted questions, I'm really happy to answer them.
Okay, Amitai, there is a question in the chat, and it's a statement first. You want me to read it out to you? I can. Okay, I'll do it. A study out of Columbia University has a model that estimates a 40 to 45% increase in homelessness this year over last year. With the anticipated increases associated with the economic impact of COVID-19 and the ending of the economic protections to prevent eviction, has there been an increase in funding to assist individuals with disabilities to ensure they are not evicted?
So I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this question, to be honest. I don't know that of funding that's specifically targeted towards people with disabilities. I know that the governor or the state offered some emergency assistance, but that got filled up very quickly. So honestly, I'm just not that familiar with the resources. If anyone else could answer, that would be better.
Gordon, you can go ahead.
Sure. Hello again. As Amitai correctly pointed out, the governor did 2 weeks ago announce the Louisiana Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It announced $24 million as the sort of floor for assistance available for people who are at risk of eviction. 12 million of the and the governor said this in his press conference, and it was pretty inside baseball-y, which was music to my ears and no one else's. But half of that funding is coming from two programs, Home and the Community Development Block Grant, which are sort of general purpose funds that are used for all sorts of different populations. Half of it is coming from the Emergency Solutions Grant, which is one of the two primary federal sources for providing anything to people experiencing homelessness, including emergency rental assistance prevention. And so, as I said before, we know that people experiencing homelessness, especially in Louisiana, are really disproportionately likely to be living with disabilities, and really disproportionately likely to be living with mental disability or developmental disability. And unfortunately, we also know that they comprise a proportionally higher portion of those who are, by HUD's definition, imminently at risk of homelessness, which would mean people who need rental assistance to prevent eviction. We're aware of the Columbia University study, and when I say we, I mean both the Housing Corporation and also all of the continuum of care leads statewide. We've had discussions about it. We're persuaded by its model to some extent. And so ultimately the question is, has there been an increase in funding to assist people with disabilities to ensure they're not evicted? The LERAP program is the first significant swipe at ensuring that that doesn't happen. 12 million out of that 24 is earmarked for people who are at risk of homelessness, who are meet sort of a higher standard of at risk of homelessness, who are more likely to experience homelessness, and who by definition are proportionally more likely to be living with some kind of a disability. My intuition is that we will probably see additional funding at some point in the future. I know that various parties are working on making that happen, but unfortunately I can't announce anything because I don't have anything in my back pocket. But I would focus instead on the fact that although the initial spend down on the LERAP program from that first 12 million is in process, that waiting list is closed, we expect another pot of money to be happening any day now that would be more specifically targeted at the population of people living with disabilities.
Thank you guys so much for that. So I'm going to now move it over to Sharon Hennessy.
Hi, my name is Sharon Hennessy. Actually, I don't have anything prepared. This was kind of a catch-all thing. I am the chairperson of the Housing Committee for the Governor's Advisory Council on Disability Affairs. And we are working towards increasing the affordable accessible housing for individuals in Louisiana. So really what I have to say is I just want to make a statement and make sure everyone deals with this and understands it. And it's open for discussion. The main way that people with disabilities, self-advocates, advocates, providers, anyone that's interested in doing this can have an effect on the affordable ability of housing and the availability of housing, affordable, accessible housing in Louisiana is to participate and advocate in the public meeting processes of the planning document or planning process of the documents that control affordable housing. Basically, HUD does some of this stuff, and it's for affordability and availability, and the Housing Corporation does another process for the basically for availability and a little bit of affordability and availability. And they both have very well-defined, very accessible public comment periods. COVID has had a little bit of impact on the public comment period, and that it's made up of the public comment period, both of them are made up of a period that allows you to make public comment by writing, by email, and also finally by an in-person meeting, and you have a choice of how you want to do it. I know the Housing Corporation this year had to change their public meeting just a little bit. They had to do a call-in to do the public meeting, but they still held it. It was well advertised and it was attended. But that's not always the case. Many times in the public hearings for both the Housing Corporation's public hearings and HUD's public hearings to the entitlement areas and so on, no one shows up. No one is there to talk about what the needs are or to participate in the planning process. And that's, I think, the big takeaway for us as advocates and self-advocates and people that are really concerned about increasing the affordable, accessible housing in Louisiana. If we don't care enough about the issues that we come up with, whether it be rental assistance, availability of housing, they can't find it, we can't find both. You can find one but not the other. If we don't care enough to show up and make comments about it and give the funders a reason to support us, can we realistically expect things to change? That's really the only question I want to ask. If we don't help people understand what it is we need and the issues that we're facing, how can we expect things to change? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, I'm looking at the chat box and I don't see any questions, but I do have a few questions I would like for Renee to answer. And that first question, Renee, is how common is housing discrimination in Louisiana, and what are warning signs housing consumers should look for? You're still on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I mentioned that we do audit investigations to see, to kind of take a good guess at what the prevalence is of housing discrimination. I'll just mention a couple, and you can read more about them on our website, read all the details. But I mentioned that accessibility audit that we did that found that 100% of multifamily developments were not in compliance with the law when it comes to accessibility design and construction standards. We also very recently did an audit looking at emotional support animals and accommodation requests for people with disabilities to have those emotional support animals in their home. And we found that 80% of landlords that were asked denied those requests, either an outright denial or they said, oh, I'll get back to you, and never got back to the individual. Some of those denials included some pretty offensive harassment of the person with a disability requesting to have the emotional support animal, making fun of the disability and questioning the need for that animal. And so that's a really common type of discrimination that we found. We've also done a lot of race testing when it comes to rentals. And consistently, we've done several of these audits now, 2007, 2014, and we recently did one. We found about a 50% rate of discrimination against Black mystery shoppers who are equally qualified to the white mystery shopper that we also send out. So we pair our mystery shoppers together. And so we know that if consistently the African-American mystery shoppers are getting worse treatment, even though they're equally qualified, that it's not based on any sort of objective standard, it's based on their race. And often we find in those instances that the housing provider will be polite, but they'll provide different treatment. So they may not even call back the Black tester. They may make an assumption about you based on your name or the sound of your voice. Or sometimes when you speak on the phone with the housing provider, they're very polite, but when you show up and they see you, either they see your race or they see your disability or they see something else about you, all of a sudden they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I just rented it to someone else, but best of luck to you. And that sort of, when something just seems off in that interaction, it's confusing, you don't know why. Maybe the housing provider tells you that the apartment's already been rented, but a week later you still see the for rent sign up, something like that, that just tells you that something is off in that interaction. We really encourage people to trust your gut instinct. Often, you may not have good proof that you're being discriminated against, but something just tells you that you are. And when we do an investigation, often we're able to confirm that. I also just wanted to say that we see very, very, very high rates of discrimination against people who use vouchers. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8. In a study that we did in 2009, we found that 82% of landlords wouldn't accept vouchers. And that's definitely an issue for people with disabilities who are disproportionately likely to have those vouchers.
Okay, wow. All right, and one other question, is there anything in particular that people should know about fair housing during the COVID pandemic?
Sure. So I think definitely the information that Amitai provided about asking for accommodations in eviction court is essential. There's a few other fair housing issues that we've seen pop up that we want folks to know about. So unfortunately, people have connected the COVID-19 pandemic and coronavirus with Asian Americans. And so we've seen an increase in national origin harassment and discrimination against people who are Asian American. We've also seen an increase in sexual harassment, especially what's called quid pro quo sexual harassment. And so that's where a housing provider often taking advantage of a tenant who is vulnerable for different reasons. So maybe they're a person of color, maybe they're undocumented, maybe they have a disability, and then who is experiencing financial difficulty. And when the housing provider tries to get that person to exchange sexual favors for rent or another housing service. And again, this happens when people are experiencing financial difficulty. And unfortunately, that's a lot of people all across the state right now. 40% of renters in Louisiana right now are saying that they don't know how they're going to pay rent next month, that they're concerned they won't be able to pay rent next month. So we're afraid that a lot of people are vulnerable to this sort of behavior. Sexual harassment in housing is sex discrimination and it's illegal, and the Fair Housing Act is a good way to hold those landlords accountable. If you do hear about this happening, what we find is that usually there isn't just one victim. There's usually a housing provider who has a pattern of targeting people for this sort of behavior. So definitely let us know. And then the last thing is just, Amitai mentioned accommodations that someone with disabilities might look for in eviction court. And so that would fall under the ADA, but there also might be housing related accommodations that you might want to ask for from a housing provider due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So if someone has a disability that makes them more vulnerable to a more severe infection, then they might ask, for example, that if the property manager has to come over to the unit, that they wear a mask anytime they're on the premises. Or if they have to have a meeting with the housing authority, you could request that that meeting occur virtually or over the phone rather than having to go in person to the housing authority. There can be a lot of different ways that people with disabilities can use Fair Housing Act protections to keep themselves safe during the pandemic.
Very good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2 questions in the chat. I'll read the first one. Have you found the lack of accessible housing has increased since Katrina in many elevating housing? I'm not quite sure who can answer that question, but any of you can jump in if you have an answer for that.
I can answer it just a little bit, and just for Baton Rouge. The only thing that I have to say about it, and I want to make space for others to try and answer as well, is that not necessarily since Katrina, but since the 2016 floods alone, we know that the affordable housing stock, which strongly correlates with the accessible housing stock, dropped something like 25% in the wake of the 2016 floods in East Baton Rouge Parish. I would imagine that other parishes were similarly affected.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, I know you said you could also take it, I'll read it. I live in Lake Charles and we only have 2 shelters for females, and one is only for domestic violence victims and the other is small and always full. We have a difficult time assisting parents with disabilities that have children. Any recommendation?
Yeah, I don't have a good recommendation. Its only virtue is that it's the right one. The reality is that there simply aren't enough emergency shelter beds, traditional emergency shelter beds, anywhere in the state of Louisiana, period. And so if you want more emergency shelter beds in Lake Charles, it's important that you advocate to those who are empowered to fund those activities and say that this is something that you're looking for. And there are a variety of options there. You can advocate to your local business association. You can advocate to your local municipal authorities. You can speak to your political leaders. Any of them are options for looking at funding availability. Though I must be honest, there's very little funding available for traditional shelter. I mean, it's very, very little. And so if emergency shelter is something that you feel Lake Charles needs locally, and as I said earlier, Lake Charles is part of my area, and I've been advocating for additional emergency shelter there for as long as I've been in this position. I encourage you to make your voice heard and known. For the immediate future, non-congregate shelter beds should be available regardless of household composition and regardless of disability status. And so I encourage you to reach out to the Calcasieu Parish Police Jury if you have a family that's in need and make that need and their contact information known. They should be able to get you squared away.
I also would just like to add, so we'd have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, but if the family is being turned away, not because the shelter is full, but because of a disability or because they have children, then we would want to take a look at that particular situation as well.
Thank you guys very much. So with no other questions in the chat, would any of you like to have any final or closing thoughts before we end the session? If not, I think we'll be done a few minutes early. And we would like all of you to all of the panelists to turn your videos on so that we could get that picture. Bambi, are you there?
I'm here.
You wanted to get a picture of everyone?
Yes. We'll get interpreters. I'll tell you when, as soon as I get my little snippet here. We appreciate y'all did a great job.
I'm sorry, did we miss Jonathan? I think are you next? So yeah, so we want to get the panelists for the housing session. Sorry, you'll be next. There we go.
Okay, just a second. Okay, y'all, YouTube's a little bit delayed, so we'll, just takes a second. Y'all can go ahead and smile. So when it comes up, you'll look great.
It's like the longest I've ever smiled in my life.
Okay, got it. Thank you,
All right.
guys. Yeah, there's about a 30-second delay, I think. Or
And-
maybe.
And so there still is a few minutes. Gordon, you had more you'd like to talk about?
Oh, well, what a terrible door for you to open. No, I think I really feel like I've hit all the big buttons. But I think want to just I want to highlight again something that I said earlier. Louisiana is so often at the bottom of those state rankings on just about everything that we can come up with, and it really breaks my heart. But in terms of homelessness, I can't overemphasize the extent to which we have done better than almost any state in the country in reducing homelessness and preventing homelessness. And so one of the fights that we continually have in one of my municipalities is over community leaders who, from time to time, see people experiencing literal homelessness on the streets, and they take it as evidence, with the best of intentions, that there is still a serious problem with homelessness in that municipality. And I agree with them; it is still a serious problem, but only insofar as every single person experiencing homelessness creates a serious problem for the municipality, because it's evidence of a broader systems failure, right? It's not about personal failure. It's about a lack of completeness of a social safety network. It's about the failure of the criminal justice system and the failure of XYZ other contributing things, our employment network, our financing networks, et cetera. And so while the evidence of homelessness is still in front of us, we haven't ended homelessness. Success can't be measured in such a binary sort of we've ended homelessness or we haven't, we've succeeded or we've failed way. it is incredibly important to me that all of you know that no matter where you live in the state, you have service providers who are actively working locally to end homelessness, who have been tremendously successful in reducing the number of people living on the streets, reducing the number of people in shelters, and doing so by moving them into permanent and self-sufficient housing, that number continues to improve despite incredibly challenging economic conditions, and that even during COVID-19, which is a nightmare pandemic, that is one of my personal greatest fears in the world. It's impossible not to recognize that it represents, through the CARES Act funding and through any additional funding, a tremendous opportunity to permanently reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness in Louisiana. That is not just an opportunity, but is a reality. We've done a tremendous job in moving folks off the streets and into shelter. And in the coming weeks, we're going to see unbelievably good numbers, historically unprecedented numbers of people moving from shelters and then to permanent housing, where they're getting the level of supportive services that they need to cultivate their own self-sufficiency. Either in terms of continuing to receive whatever level of subsidy they need, or returning to a position where they no longer need a subsidy. And so in terms of giving everyone something good to walk away from on a Friday afternoon with a little bit of extra time, you can be genuinely proud of the state that you live in, the community that you live in, and the social services network that you necessarily support, even if indirectly, because our contending with homelessness during the COVID-19 pandemic especially has really been a national best practice from start to finish.
Thank you so much for that information. Sounds like some good things are coming. There are no other questions. 5 minutes left, well, for about 4 minutes left to end this session. So Bambi, I think we can go ahead and stop it now.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it so much. Really informative information. And thank you, Melanie, for doing such a great job of facilitating that discussion. What we'll do now is we will continue to have our Zoom. You could stay, if you logged into Zoom, or you could stay watching on YouTube. Our next session starts at 2 o'clock, and it will be on transportation for people with disabilities. So right now we'll just have a break, and we'll see you back on at 2 o'clock.
Hello, everyone. Do we have Jonathan Bolin on? Stephanie, I know you're here.
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm on.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for participating, and we're glad to have you on representing the DOTD. Is Mark on? So we're waiting on Mark too. I'm going to give him a call in a few moments.
Jamar, I'll text him to see.
Okay, thank you. How you doing, Jonathan?
Hey, pretty good, Shamar. How you been?
I'm doing well, man. We're got a lot of things going right now, and we're just trying to move forward with what I can and things I can control.
That's
Oh.
it. Yeah, that's it. Just doing what you can, however you can right now. Doing a remote conference.
Man, we have exceeded our own expectations on how effective we were able to work. But we've been working as a team, and it's been paying off dividends that we're able to make this happen. And thanks to participants like yourself, we can make the show go on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a definitely important conversation to have because transportation touches everything.
Yeah, and like I said, man, we're gonna do some good work on our transportation committee. We have some really good participants, and I think that what you're doing in Rapides um, can help other parishes as well. And we really like what you have going on there and how you're making things work with what you have.
Thank you. Can't wait to share it.
Stephanie, are you going to present a PowerPoint presentation?
No, I'm just gonna free flow it.
Okay, all right. And if you need to share your screen, let me know, and we can work it out. Jonathan, will you be presenting anything in terms of slides?
No, no slides. Just
Okay.
like Stephanie. Just
Okay,
want
perfect.
to get down to the meat and potatoes.
Awesome.
Jamar, Mark said he's on.
Okay, great. We'll go ahead and start in a few moments.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamar Lanier Ennis, and I'm Assistant Director at the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs. This is the transportation session within the GODA conference. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have three remarkable panelists that have some great information to share with you. First, I would like to introduce Ms. Stephanie Bartholomew. Stephanie has varied experience with federal claims and project management and has led the charge with federal reporting, policy development, and grant oversight for the transportation programs within DOT for the last 6 years. She has a bachelor's and master's degree and has state experience with the Department of Health and Hospitals and Louisiana Workforce Commission. Stephanie believes in quality customer service and is passionate about ensuring equitable service for all. Mr. Jonathan Boland, he serves as the Transportation Director for the Rapides Area Planning Commission in Alexandria-Pineville Metropolitan Planning Organization, addressing regional mobility, community resiliency, and hazard mitigation as part of the MPO's Coordinated Human Services Transportation Program. Jonathan created the Central Louisiana Coordinated Transportation Coalition for the 8 parishes Central Louisiana region, coordinating regional planning, resources, and policy recommendations for public and nonprofit transportation agencies who provide urban, elderly, disabled, and rural transit service. Before joining RAPC, he has served as City Resilience Officer, Assistant Operations Chief, and Director of Policy, Research, and Public Relations for the City of Alexandria. Mr. Mark Raymond is our third panelist. Mark Raymond Jr. serves as the founder and CEO of the Split Second Foundation. Is a 501c3 organization committed to breaking physical, societal, and research barriers for people with physical disabilities by undertaking activities to support causes and facilities that support the disabled community. Mark is a mayoral appointed commissioner for the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority, where he serves as the vice chairman of the board, the chairman of finance committee. He is also a founding member of the Trust Your Work Foundation and is a founding member of the Family Patient Advisory Committee for the University Medical Center. In addition to, he has worked for CBS, Fox Sports, ESPN as a broadcast engineer, and he is responsible for technical components of televised broadcasting of major sporting events and music festivals around the United States. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask Ms. Stephanie Bartholomew to lead off and represent the Department of Transportation.
Sure. Okay, I'll just give you guys a brief overview of our transportation program. We currently have 3 programs that we are federally funding, which is 5310, Elderly and Persons with Disabilities Program, 5311, Rural Public Transportation Program, and 5316, which is the Job Access Reverse Commute Program. The 5310 program is basically it meets the transportation needs of the elderly persons and persons with disabilities. Some of the agencies classifies their elderly as 60 or older. It provides transportation to those individuals that does not have access to public transportation. The agencies that are eligible to apply for that program are a nonprofit 501c3 program, and they must have a transportation program for more than a year to qualify. The 5311 Rural Public Transportation Program, it provides transportation for on-demand response in the rural and small urban areas, basically like a city bus transportation. They can go anywhere to like a doctor's appointment, shopping, school, employment, anything you could think of. That's what the 5311 program is for. Then we have the 5316, which is the Job Access Reverse Commute Program. This provides transportation services to individuals who are welfare recipients and other low-income persons to jobs and other employment-related services. We currently have about 37 general public transit providers, which fall under the 5311 program, and about over close to 70-something 5310 agencies. Well, let me back up. Louisiana has a transit providers guide. So with that guide, you can actually go in there and see all the transportation agencies that we have provided that we're actually funding under those grants. I will provide the link in the chat shortly if you want to have access to that. It provides who the director is, the contact information, what services they provided, if they're open or closed transportation services or an on-demand response service. And if you want to ask any questions to those directors, you can contact them directly. Their number and also their email address will be provided on the Louisiana Transit Resource Guide. The agencies actually update their information in the Transit Resource Guide every year. The beginning of each fiscal year, they're required to go in and update the information. Sometimes we do tend to have a turnover with directors, but not too often. If anyone is interested in these programs, you can actually go to our DOTD Public Transit website, click on LA Team Online Application. It actually went live last Monday, July 13th. You can submit your application. The deadline is actually November 1st of 2020. For anyone that's new, you have if you're applying for 5311, you have the whole year to apply. You don't have to wait to rush and meet the deadline for November 1st. All our current agencies, they are required to submit their applications by November 1st. We also provide training and support to our agencies, which is through the RTAP program, where we actually fund for those agencies to have training for their drivers, such as if they need to go and do a driver training or they have anything that they need for their drivers, we provide that. We actually go through our MPOs to provide those services and pay for it out of our federal funds. The current updates for our agencies, currently majority of our 5311 agencies are open. Some of them are open and some are closed. It varies every week due to the COVID. If they have a staff member or any clients that has gotten the COVID virus, then they are shut down for at least 2 weeks until further notice. Right now, some are providing limited services to doctor's appointments and essential needs only. And then majority of our 5310s, they're currently closed due to the COVID-19. I think we have like a handful that's either providing limited services for the ones that are working in their actual facilities that they have available and some that are not operating at all. And that's pretty much my update for DOTD on our transit system.
Thank you, Stephanie. Would you
You're
mind
welcome.
staying on and seeing if there's any questions that may be asked for the department?
Sure.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. Now that DOTD has presented, I'm going to ask Mr. Jonathan Boland to share his presentation.
And Jamar, there is one question from chat. I'm going to put it in here and you can let her answer whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'd like to go ahead and follow up on what Stephanie was saying and take you down from a state level to a regional level. So I represent RAPC and the Alexandria Pineville Metropolitan Planning Organization. So RAPC operates in partnership with DOTD, a program known as Coordinated Human Service Transportation for each region. So the regions typically mirror the LDH regions. So LDH Region 6 is the region that we administer for our Human Services Coordinated Transportation Program. So every 2 years, part of what we do, we work with the 5310, 5311, and 5307 transportation agencies and human service agencies. Our job is to really interface and bring them at the table so we can hear the concerns from the human service agencies about the needs, or transportation challenges that their clients may be facing and the transportation providers who offer that service. And the idea is to connect the two together and to discuss whatever issue that may come out just through communication and coordination. So, in our region, we have 4 agencies that are 5310s that serve disabled, and we only have 3 5311 agencies. There's one in Vernon, one in Rapides, and one in Boyles. Some parishes in our region are completely underserved by transportation, such as Grant Parish, for example. There's no transportation program for 5310 that's elderly or disabled or for rural general public transportation itself. So we have huge gaps in the regions that we've been working to address through these coordinated efforts. Of course, we're limited in terms of funding and capability as to what we can do as an agency, a planning agency, but our goals again are to try to connect agencies to the transportation providers themselves. And from that dialogue, we've identified several different issues that we've been working to address. The first of which was just resource awareness. A lot of the human service agencies in our region, not all the time, but sometimes we'll have periods of frequent turnover in staff. And every time we have new caseworkers that come in, they need to be acclimated to the available transportation resources that we have. And so to piggyback off of what the DOTD had started with their transportation resource guide, we had taken one and started to develop that for our region. And that guide was a tool, had 2 purposes. First of which was to communicate and convey to the public what is out there and what's available in terms of transportation. And then secondly, for those human service agencies and caseworkers who are trying to coordinate those client trips for just general, any purpose type of transportation, from non-emergency medical to everyday errands. Many of our transportation agencies, especially those who are 5310 that work as ARCs or associations for persons with developmental disabilities, they do a lot of transportation for job sites. So every year, what we tend to do, we have 4 quarterly coordination meetings. We have 1 big regional workshop every 2 years where we bring our policy legislators, our other officials at the table to communicate to them what the needs and challenges are in their areas facing transportation. In other words, it's all about promoting awareness, resources that are available, things that we need to continue to enhance regional mobility for residents in their areas. And then every year we like to touch base with our transportation providers. We tend to either make a in-person, you would call it a site visit, but it's not necessarily that. We'd call it just a visit. We like to go in and touch base with our providers and hear from them what their challenges are. And what we tend to do is that after you meet with all the transportation providers in the region, you identify several common issues that may be facing certain providers. And that was one such issue that we uncovered surrounding the single consolidated waiver that was coming down the pipeline originally for 2020, now at 2021. We had transportation providers that interface at the 5310 level that really had some questions about how the new single consolidated waiver would affect their transportation programs, would affect their operations, would affect having to transport their clients. And so that was one of the things that was first brought to attention in our region just through this outreach. The next step was to sit down and discuss with DOTD and other relevant stakeholders, our local LDH regional office and our regional, the Central Louisiana Human Services District on what the challenges are facing transportation providers, not just with the single consolidated waiver, but other issues such as funding. We wanted to also identify common successes, in other words, solutions that other agencies are doing, such as fundraising efforts to help boost that local match for those transportation related grants that Stephanie had mentioned for 5310 or 5311. And we want to continue to put resources into the tools of our resource tools into the hands of our transportation agencies so they can go out and lobby support, more local support for their transportation programs and efforts. So, Following again off of what Stephanie was saying, many of our agencies due to COVID are either not operating or operating with limited service. And it varies from agency to agency based off of the individual staff's needs and the capabilities or capacities that that agency may have right now. So we have some agencies, again, that are ranging from shuttered to just providing transportation to job sites or program related transportation only. So the transportation landscape in the region right now is certainly affected by the pandemic. But if you were to go to pre-COVID, we were fortunate enough to have the resources that we do in our region. But what we're trying to focus on now is enhancing regional mobility for LDH Region 6. And so a couple of projects that we're working on as a planning commission is researching the feasibility and business model development for an RTA to implement that in the region. So we have our human service agency providers, our 5310s, our 5311. We have our intercity bus service, which would be a Greyhound. Although limited, we do have it, but we are missing the regional transportation element connecting parishes and cities together within our region. And so that's the next big thing that we're hoping to work on right now. But again, our primary function through the Human Services Coordinated Transportation Program and the Central Louisiana Coordinated Transportation Coalition is to connect the dots, to take the folks that operate the system and folks that use the system and the folks that administer and govern the system, sit them down at the table to address the issues through coordination and communication. And that's pretty much it for what we do here at our shop for Region 6.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we'll come back and I'm sure that there's some questions that our attendees will have. Mark, we're going to ask you to come on and give your presentation.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Mark Raymond Jr. I serve as the vice chair for the Regional Transit Authority. I've been on the board now for nearly 2 years, and I was appointed by the mayor to really represent the disabled community and see what enhancements we could make based off of feedback from someone who actually used the service. So a lot of my initial thoughts came from my experience prior to being a board member, which were, poor performance on on-time pickups, which would a lot of times would make me late for doctor's appointments. And then on the back end, I would have to wait for a vehicle to return to pick me up. So it was just a very inefficient process. And a lot of what we've been pushing the Regional Transit Authority to do is modernize our technology and our approach, i.e. using Uber-like software to help do a much quicker booking for these individual trips. So we're moving on that. We actually received grant funding to do a pilot program in New Orleans East that would do that. Effectively, it would be more like an on-demand transit option for paratransit. So miles from where we were 2 years ago. But we've also put a huge focus on our people approach, how we engage with customers. Another big problem that I always faced was long wait times when I would call to schedule my trips. So we've reduced that number from an average of 5 minutes to under 1 minute. And I think the next big problem that we need to tackle as a transit agency is the discrimination that we still practice on the majority of our transit options, i.e., first of all, the St. Charles streetcar line is for the most part inaccessible. And we had an ADA lawsuit brought by Mr. Andy Beiser to help address some of that. And the change that came out of it, or the settlement, was that we would put 2 accessible streetcars on the route, and they would be able to drop off at 6 stops out of the 52 stops. So if I wanted to use the St. Charles streetcar to go to a restaurant, I would have to pick one of these 6 stops to get off at, which could be anywhere from 1 mile to 2 miles from where I actually want to go, which is a huge problem. It's a huge discrimination. So the board, led by some of my direction, has asked the CEO to conduct a feasibility study on what it would require to make all of our transit options completely accessible in the city of New Orleans. I have this theory that we should be a world-class transit providing city. And in order to do that, we can't discriminate on people. We can't turn down disabled people, and we really need to have a universally accessible system. And another big thing that we've been pushing is connectivity with the rest of the state and parishes, and how do we have a bigger voice for commuter rail and that level of connectivity. So I'm really excited for what the future holds for Louisiana, and I'm excited to be a member of GACTA and co-chair for the Transportation Committee. I look forward to doing all of this great work alongside some of my esteemed colleagues. And if anyone has any questions for me, I'm here to answer them.
Okay, great. And thank you all for presenting today. And if we can, we do have some questions, and we would like to try to use the remaining time as possibly like a Q&A session to talk about various things, such as how groups, local entities, such as Rapides and the New Orleans area, can effectively give advice to other cities, towns, other jurisdictions in our state to work on transportation, or just building a network to address transportation concerns and mobilizing efforts to improve things. Is there anyone that wants to speak on that particular topic?
Jamar, can you repeat that question and also ask all the panelists to start their cameras?
Yes. Did everybody hear Bambi? If you can start your cameras and take yourselves off mute. I would like the panelists to share, particularly Mark and Jonathan, to share some ideas of how local entities, within the state, cities, towns can build their own transportation initiatives to address and try to resolve some of the shortcomings of transportation for their local areas. And y'all can take turns sharing your thoughts of how to build it. And I know, Jonathan, that you probably have more experience in this regard. So if you want to go first.
Absolutely,
Take it
Jamal.
on.
The first piece of advice I'd give to anybody is that, there's somebody like me in each region of the state. So in each region of the state, DOTD has a coordinated human services transportation program that is administered through their MPO office. So I would, first of all, recommend them to reach out to their local MPO, their Metropolitan Planning Organization. In Lake Charles, let's see, Shreveport, that will be the Northwest Louisiana Council of Governments. Central Louisiana is RAPC. We have the Capital Area Planning Commission in Baton Rouge, the Acadian Planning Commission in Lafayette, MCAL, which is in Lake Charles. And then we have South Central Planning Commission, and there's another one. Stephanie, what's the one I'm missing? The New Orleans region. Is that RPC, the Regional Planning Commission? Yeah. So each one of those agencies I mentioned, there is my counterpart, the Human Services Transportation Program Coordinator. I would start with DOTD and get their information, or reach out to that MPO, just do a quick Google search, find that MPO, find that program, and go to the table and sit with them and start coordinating. The program each year has basically a coordinated plan that it updates every 2 years, and that's where you want to have that discussion between, identifying first of all what transportation resources you would have available, and then working with that group and other community stakeholders to take it to the next level, to expand and develop that transportation system, just like what you just heard down there with RTA in New Orleans, where they get feedback, they are responsive, so they're going out and trying to improve the accessibility and the connectivity of their system. But for us, we're at the regional level, and we really focus mostly on coordination. So for any agency out there, if you're looking to find out what resources are available, assistance for grant opportunities, especially the DOTD grant opportunities for 5310 and 5311 assistance, your MPO would be a great place to start. And that program is, again, a great way to sit down and to work with not only your other transportation stakeholders are at the table, but ideally other community stakeholders from other groups throughout the community, and your political figures, to actually have some teeth behind whatever you guys come out with. So, more importantly, for any agency that's looking to sustain a program, you've got to have that funding in place. You've got to have your local support. You've got to have that local match if you're going to go out, especially start expanding your transportation program using grant resources. They all require, most of them, unless you're lucky to sit in on CARES Act funding right now with 100% federal share, most of these programs require a local share, a fund match, 50% for operating, 25% for capital. I think it's 15 or 20% if you're looking to buy a bus that has a wheelchair lift. But again, you have to have that local fund match to not just get the equipment for the capital purchase, but to sustain operations. And coming to the table, letting them hear you, making yourself heard, and then hearing from them what those issues are, the challenges facing your region, is a great start. We've had some folks that come to the table for the first time. Our major medical centers, both of them are in Alexandria. We had them sitting at the table for the first time with our rural transit public providers, which they were unaware of. And we were talking about discharging patients from the major medical centers to areas that were outside of the available transit system. They were discharging patients on ambulances. Little did they know until they were at the table that there's a rural parish public provider that can provide that same trip for a fraction of the cost. So that's just a sample of the information that you can come across just by coming to the table and participating at those quarterly Human Service Transportation Coalition meetings.
Great.
That's all I have. That's the first step. Do I have any other questions or anything I can answer?
We're going to move to the next question.
Jamar, are you having difficulty with your sound?
Okay, y'all able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, thanks. Mark, is there anything you wanted to add to what Jonathan had to contribute?
No, I think Jonathan summed that up beautifully.
Okay. All right, great. We do have a question in the chat, presumably for DOTD, and anyone is at liberty to answer who knows the answer. The question is there transportation for people with disabilities to and from college if they have health challenges that impose health issues to ride the public bus? So I think the question was, the first half of it is, are there transportation for individuals with disabilities to go to college who may have some health challenges?
We do have transportation available, but it's not just to say that that agency is going to provide transportation only to that individual just to go to college and back and forth. As far as 5311, it is a public body. It would service the public, so anybody could ride the vehicles to go anywhere. 5310 is just for elderly and disabled clients. Those clients they have to go through a specialized, some agencies actually have where you have to apply through their 5310 program to get qualified so they can provide transportation service to you all. However, if you don't qualify, there are other agencies probably in that area that you can go through to see if they can provide those type of transportations to you. But to say that we're going to have a transportation provider that only provides services to that one person that has a disability to and from college for that one trip is not going to be like that. For 5311, it's really like a public city type transportation. Is on demand. You schedule your transportation that you need for that day, and then that agency provider actually puts you on with other clients. So you're not riding that by yourself. So the trip might not be specifically for just to go to college. You can be ride with someone that has to go to a doctor's appointment, someone that has to go shopping. So it's not going just to that actual university or college to drop off someone.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with that. In our region, if you were somebody who was looking for a disabled transportation provider, you have to first go to the Central Louisiana Human Services District and get a waiver. You have to get on that waiting list, and those waivers are there's only so many waivers that are available, and they're prioritized based off of need. So, there's a chance that, you can go in and you qualify and you get a waiver, and you could be eligible for that service provided by that disabled 5310 provider for that. And the only other option, like Stephanie said, was that you if available, you could get a rural transit provider call and schedule a ride in advance and have them, bring you to and from campus. We're trying to work on this in our region with our local community technical college. We have a system, Central Louisiana is very rural, very agrarian, a lot of spatial gaps, a lot of temporal gaps as far as trying to put a service together and operate that. So we have a technical community college system that has 6 campuses spread out throughout the region. The newest one is in downtown Alexandria. And we did a commuter survey with them. And one of the things that we identified were in previous years, we had rural providers that actually had contracts with those campuses to provide transportation service for their student populations. There was agreement between the school and the provider itself. But again, if you're looking for specialized transportation, it has to start with the waiver for that provider. So we've had cases before COVID where we've had disabled providers in our region that have the capability, the space, the capacity to handle more folks, but they would be limited based off of the waivers that they could receive from the Human Services District or that were allotted at that time. So it is a challenge in our region, but again, start there. And if you don't have any luck, move to contacting your rural public transit provider. And that's not to say that in your region, you may have some type of specialized nonprofit that's out there that's under the radar. But typically for the programs that we administer or work and coordinate with, they're working with DOTD through 5310, 5311, or your small urban transit system, which would be 5307. We aspire to get to where they are with the RTA in New Orleans and other parts of the state. That's where we want to be. But you know, to serve those specialized needs that are out there. But we've got to lay the groundwork first before we can build it. So that's Central Louisiana.
This is Bambi. Can I ask a question for clarification, Jonathan? You talked about waiver and there's so many different waivers whenever you're dealing with disability systems. What waiver specifically are you talking about?
Well, that's when it gets into the weeds for me.
Is it a waiver through the developmental disability waiver?
Yes.
Okay, so like a now waiver or supports waiver?
Yes, and so there's
Okay.
now, there's supports waiver, and that's what kind of started the discussion when we were doing our outreach for the new single consolidated waiver.
Right.
Everybody on the LDH side was hearing about, it's coming down the pipeline, but in the DOTD side, we didn't really know because we're only interfacing with FTA DOTD programs and not Medicare, Medicaid, LDH necessarily. You know, there are trips where they interface, and these two providers, you know, you'll have one provider that's operating at 5310, 5311, and serving as a Medicaid provider as well. So we would be hearing this from one provider about these different issues. And then when we sat down and we identified it, we said, okay, it comes down to these waivers that are coming out. And then, you know, again, the big issue with the new single consolidated supports waiver, how is that going to affect transportation service? What transportation trips would, what's going to be considered an eligible transportation expense under that, so on and so forth. But just for clarification's sake, those would be the waivers that I was referring to, the ones that are administered through your human services districts.
Thank you.
And also, as far as the New Orleans metro area, anyone looking to go to school can utilize the paratransit service if you have a disability.
All right, thank you. There is a question for Mark, and I think you're the appropriate person to answer this from our chat. Why is it that accessibility on the streetcars is such a difficult task to accomplish since they are funded by public monies and many streetcars have been put in service in recent years?
Well, the initial streetcar line, the St. Charles line specifically wasn't designed before it was designed well before the ADA. And then it became a National Historic Monument. So there's just a lot of red tape that we have to get around when it comes to that conversation. And the cars themselves are historically designated. Not to say that historical designation should ever trump ADA or functionality. That's the biggest problem I have, but those are the arguments that have been previously made. Now, the new lines, the Canal Street line is completely accessible. The Rampart Street line is completely accessible. And the cars on the lines themselves are accessible as well. The biggest issue is just the St. Charles line. I hope I answered that question sufficiently.
For some reason, I'm getting muted. Yeah, and I do realize that some of the designations are troublesome, like, and not only for transportation, but the accessibility of buildings who have the historical tag. But it's a shame that people of all walks of life can't enjoy their features and as intended. There is a question, and I think this is appropriate for all three of our panelists. Is there transportation providers who are fluent in ASL and other languages for ELL individuals with disabilities? And if I get clarification on the acronym, that would be great.
That's English language learners.
Okay, thank you.
With our 5311 and 5310 programs, they are required to have an LEP policy where they coordinate with their local EIL companies or anyone that can translate for them. So they are required by FTA and DOTD to have a policy in place where if they were to have any clients that are rhyme with them or associated with them and need assistance to communicate through them.
All right, thank you.
I was going to say that pretty much every agency that applies for DOTD or FTA assistance is required to have a Title VI plan. In that plan, they would have their ESL or LEP policy in there. So it depends on the agency. They're all required to have it, but how they do it's a little different. Some use apps. Some may have the benefit of having bilingual staff on hand. But again, there is some mechanism that is required in place for each agency that at least receives public money.
And at this time, are there any updates or any projects, programs that your respective agencies are working on that our panel, that our participants may want to, that you want to share?
Just for me, in the mission of advancing regional mobility, we have the RTA study, and that's something that we're just getting off the ground. When we start to do our public outreach, it's going to be rather robust and include not just members of the general public, but also human service agency. I mean, it's very robust, but that's a project that I think, at least for Central Louisiana, is going to be important to addressing those mobility gaps. And the other project we have on the inner ring of our area, we're looking at, we're currently conducting a study on our urban transit system that's been conducted in 30 years. Because we know that although maybe that transportation system hasn't moved in 30 years, population groups have certainly shifted, and the cities have moved and changed in the meantime. So we're really trying to conduct a systemic overhaul, or analysis first, and then an overhaul of mobility in the whole area, first focusing on urban and then the regional. So those are the two most exciting projects that we have right now. Unfortunately, they're planning projects, but a necessary first step to getting it done.
This is Bambi. I have a question, or maybe just a comment from Mark. Mark, you're now one of the co-chairs for our Transportation Committee for the Governor's Advisory Council on Disability Affairs, and it seems like to have Jonathan and his counterparts across the state to participate in that might be helpful in kind of moving things forward. I don't know if any of you have any comments or thoughts about that.
That's exactly what I was sitting here thinking about when it comes to. So right now, the RTA is undertaking a standpoint to be more have a larger presence in the region, i.e., we solely operate pretty much in Orleans Parish, which leaves out our residents in St. Bernard, and then connect in Jefferson Parish. There's just not enough fluent connectivity between our New Orleans metro area and more broadly throughout the state. So how do we develop a bigger coalition of transit agencies to provide these services? And I think that's critical. So I would say, yeah, I would love to have more conversations with Jonathan about, little things that we can start to do to implement and work towards this bigger change and bigger goal.
Jonathan, you're muted.
I'd happy to be a part of it. Anytime you guys have any questions or need any input, I'd be happy to share my perspective on what we're doing in our region with you guys. I noticed there was another question here that was talking about simple paving and accessible curving. How could that be? It says simple paving and accessible curving should be easily accomplished. It's it's all easily accomplished if you just coordinate and get at the table and start programming these projects. There are great funding opportunities that come out on an annual basis. However, you may find yourselves like we did in our region where, great, is an awesome funding opportunity, but we don't have the plan in hand to go out and obtain the funding. We can write a grant, but we don't know what we want to fund. We don't have a plan in hand. So what we're doing now, we're putting a plan together. There's a great program out there that's 5339. It's the FTA designation for cities and transit agencies, but that's buses and bus facilities. That's pretty much, I think 2 years ago, the last time I did the project like that, that's fixing infrastructure, sidewalks, streetscapes, ADA, everything around that bus stop by up to half a mile in some cases. So, you know, you have programs out there, but you have grant opportunities out there. But coming to the table and talking about what those problems are, identifying them, and then putting a plan together, then you can go out and fund and implement those changes. A lot of people, this is again my perspective, a lot of people think that, you know, government has this omnipresent view about everything that's going on in every single piece of time. But the folks that, for example, in their neighborhoods that walk those sidewalks every day, that drive those streets every day, that operate, live, work, commute in and out of those areas every day, they know that area better than somebody else that's coming around every quarter or once a month or twice a year. And those are the people that need to be heard and brought to the table, and their input needs to not only be gathered, but that's when you can start making a plan of action to go out and address those problems. But it starts again with communication and coordination.
I would like to second that. And for the New Orleans metro area, it's prioritizing which streets and sidewalks need to be done and getting them in the queue quickly. Because unfortunately, with anything that has to go through that much bureaucracy, it's just going to take time. And Jonathan, to your point, the sooner we start that planning process, the better the quicker it'll get done. But there is monies earmarked for that, to your point.
Yeah, and that's right, Mark. And the other part of it is when it comes down to funding, local funding, the more local match you have, let's say if you had all the local funding to do the program and you didn't need a grant, you can implement that project as fast as you want. But when you have to use federal funding and you have to use partner agencies, it takes a little bit more time. It takes a lot of patience. But it's the slow way. If you have the money to do it yourself, go out and do it yourself. If you don't, you have to get a local match together. You gotta have to sit down and work with the other agencies, and people just need to understand that these things take time. But more importantly, you have to bring them up to our attention, and we have to know them. And again, I keep coming back to it, and I'm going to stop. But it's coordinating and coming to the table is the first step. First step.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Is this a comment or a question that I'm looking at? Jefferson Parish has it in their plan to make all curbing accessible. They recurb often, especially as other work is done. So I think that's a comment. So that's positive to hear.
And there's a question above that one.
Okay. What do we have?
Do we have any opportunities in the works with expanding transportation services in the rural areas?
Just the planning study that we've mentioned right now for our region in Central Louisiana. We are always trying to plug human service agencies and other stakeholders into our public 5311, our rural public transit providers. We always have an issue of empty seats, but we always have demand for rides. And so really that comes down to people coordinating and getting these trips. Utilizing what we have is step one, because if we can't keep those providers you know, that represents an even larger challenge for the region. But as far as our plans, first, it stays at just trying to maximize what we have. We have 3 providers, one in the Vernon, Rapides, and Avoyelles. We try to maximize those as much as possible. They go to other parishes sometimes, not to pick up trips, but they'll take somebody from Vernon Parish, for example, to a doctor's appointment in New Orleans or Shreveport or Baton Rouge or wherever. These folks travel all over the place. But again, we have parishes in our region that have nothing. And there is no program. There is no senior transportation program. There is no disabled transportation program. There is no public rural transportation program. And so what we're trying to do in those areas is we're trying to identify nonprofits that are under our radar that are doing this service. And so that's one other step that you can go out and find them. And then if they're qualified 501c3 or certified nonprofit, you want to then work with them to build their transportation program to where they're eligible to apply for 5311 assistance or 5310 assistance. But at the same time, that's all we can do right now in our region to expand rural mobility. Again, we've got the study underway on how we want to roll that out of RTA in central Louisiana. But for the time being, what do we do? So we're trying to maximize what we have and identify other players that we can bring to the table, build them up to make them bona fide, certified, rural public transit providers, and potentially partners for the MPA moving forward.
I have a question for Stephanie. Stephanie, where can we find the information of the providers of those grants, the 5310 and 5311?
To find the current providers, it's called Louisiana Transit Resource Guide. I provided in the link in the chat. Are you able to see it?
Okay, I didn't know. See, I'm asking and you thought about it before. So.
I've uploaded in the chat the access to go directly to the application and also direct access to our provider's guide.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Melanie, can you transfer that link over to our YouTube so the people on YouTube can get that link? That's 2 different links.
Sure, and there are a few other questions here, Jamar, if you wanted to go through those.
Okay, great. All right, I do see a very good question, and it's relative to rideshare. Are there opportunities currently for public-private partnerships with entities like Uber and Lyft to expand transit and paratransit operations for individuals with disabilities?
Yes, there are opportunities. I will say RTA is currently exploring those partnerships specifically with Uber and Lyft, but they do exist in other municipalities around the country. Uber specifically has a lot of partnerships to do last mile pickups and supplemental paratransit pickups when necessary. We just haven't engaged in that conversation yet.
I would love to participate in engagement of those conversations to help move things forward if that's what we need. And I think that's something that the GACTA Transportation Committee would certainly most be interested in helping if that's what's needed. If there's more advocacy, if there's more whatever needs to be done. I'm 100% sure that the Transportation Committee and other advocates similarly situated will gladly participate in helping in that. So if there's information to be shared about how to engage rideshare companies, please, we could talk offline about that. So I think that's the missing piece to our puzzle in trying to expand the opportunities as the question came about. I see we have roughly 20 minutes. Are there any additional comments? from our panelists or closing remarks that you would like to share with our participants?
I'd just like to remind everyone about our application process. It is up and open, and anybody that's interested in applying, if you're a new agency or provider that you're interested in the 5311 or 5310 or 5316 program, just go on the link that I provided in the chat. Just keep in mind, if you're a new agency, you have more up to a year to apply. Current agencies, they have to apply, and the deadline is November 1st. And to make sure that they go to our resource guide, they want to see all the agencies that we have providing services to their different areas in Louisiana.
Mark, you want to go?
Sure. I was just gonna say, anybody who is in the New Orleans metro area and needs paratransit services, you can visit norta.com to get any information and to get the application to fill out. It's pretty quick and simple. I think they even offer to pick you up from your home and bring you to RTA to take care of your identification card. And anybody who needs to access me, you can email me at mraymond at no. I'm sorry, it's mraymond at rtaforward.org.
And I'll follow up and say, for the regional perspective, please take a moment to plug in with your local MPO, your regional metropolitan planning organization, and reach out to that point of contact for their human services transportation program. If anything, to touch base with them, and then whenever we start resuming quarterly meetings, have quarterly meetings, come to the meetings and participate, because you're going to find out a lot of information, but that's also how you can communicate what those needs that you're experiencing at your agency with your clients to those transit providers and the other folks at the table.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I would like to thank our panelists for taking time to participate in this session. I think some great information has been shared, and we look forward to working with everyone moving forward as we try to work on our concerns and improve our transportation in our state. So with that being said, we're going to end this session a little early, and we will begin our next session, which is voting accessibility, which features Michelle Bishop and Jamie Duplashin at 3:30.
Jamar, this is Bambi. We'll start back at 3:15. I want to do an introduction of our staff at that time. And so if everyone could just get back here at 3:15, we'll do that and then move into that last session. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Great session.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, everyone. Our next session, which is our last session on voting accessibility, starts at 3:30. But I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce everyone to the team that put on this conference, the staff of the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs. We received so many compliments about how well the conference has gone, and I wanted to make sure that the credit is given to the people behind the scenes who have worked to put it together. So I'm gonna ask for all of our staff and interns to turn on their cameras so we can see you all. Okay, great. See all your beautiful faces. Now, what I'm gonna do is I'll introduce each person one at a time and just give them an opportunity just to share a little bit about what they do and whatever they want to share. It's their time. They spend a lot of time putting this conference together and just want to give them a few moments to be able to talk about what's important to them. So I will, if you guys, thank you. You look beautiful. If you would turn off your cameras, everyone except Jamar, I'll introduce Jamar first. Usually it's the ladies that go first, but since Jamar is so outnumbered, we'll go with him first. Jamar is the Assistant Director in the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs, and he is really just such a great support to me, and I get a lot of credit that really should go to Jamar because he's always there doing the work. And if you've met Jamar, you know that he's such a great person and a resource in trying to help constituents in the state of Louisiana. So Jamar, I'm gonna turn it over to you and let you just say a few words.
Well, thank you for those kind remarks, Bambi, and certainly I follow leadership, and you've been remarkable on all fronts since you've came on in 2016. So yeah, you make my job that much more easier and a pleasure to serve in this capacity. So what I do, well, one, I do everything else that the office needs. Primarily, I focus on constituent concerns and the advisory council, just being a main conduit to whatever the council needs for them to be successful, whether it's serving, I guess, executing tasks of the council for whatever they need to do for meetings, setting up, getting personnel involved, and also the programs that Governor's Office of Disability Affairs has. Um, I'm responsible for the coordination of it and working with other people in our office, such as Melanie, who's going to be introduced later, and Silk, the director for Silk, Jessica Lewis, who's going to also be introduced in a few moments, and just being the catch-all for whatever this office needs to get done. So we wake up, we know that the expectations are high and that there's a need for people to be served, and we make sure we live up to the expectations that you have that are incumbent on us. So, and yeah, so long story short, I could be long-winded, but I'm choosing not to do that. So, um, yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and we're glad to put this conference on for everyone.
Thanks, Jamar. Next, I will introduce Jessica. If Jessica can turn on her video. Jessica is the director of the Statewide Independent Living Council, and she has been working in the governor's office with that council since 2016. We really appreciate all the work and help that Jessica does to make our office run smoothly. And I will give Jessica just a few moments to be able to share whatever she wants to share about herself, or anything else. So go ahead, Jessica.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me through the phone?
We can hear you. Yep.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay, great. So as Bambi stated, I'm the executive director for the statewide Independent Living Council. And basically, our council is made up of individuals that are extreme advocates, nationally wise as well as statewide. We collaborate with the Centers for Independent Living in order to carry out some of the services, core services for individuals with disabilities in order for them to be able to live independently. With some of those places that we collaborate with, our centers, we have 8 of those throughout the state, with our core centers being in Lake Charles, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Shreveport. And we work with them to effectively execute a 3-year state plan for independent living for individuals with disabilities. We have an annual job and resource fair for individuals with disabilities, as well as we have a Rev Up campaign that we have launched, which you'll hear more about today with Ms. Jamie Duplichan. And pretty much that's pretty much it. We serve as a council within the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs, and we just try to assist individuals with disabilities to be able to live independently and have a great life with doing so.
Thank you, Jessica. And next I'll introduce Melanie Washington. Melanie is the director of the State Interagency Coordinating Council for Early Steps. Melanie has worked in our office for about 2.5 years now. Time goes by so fast. And Melanie's just really been so helpful. And as you've seen today, how she's facilitated these sessions wonderfully, magnificently, and we really appreciate that. So Melanie, if you would just share a little bit about yourself and about the work that you do. You need to unmute yourself, Melanie.
Good evening. It's been a long day. Yes, so I'm the executive director of the SICC, which is the State Interagency Coordinating Council for Early Steps. And so most people probably know Early Steps is a statewide program that provides services to families who have children with developmental disabilities. And so our council helps to, make sure that Early Steps has, everything that it needs. And we get together quarterly just to kind of make sure things are functioning the way that they should. I also, because I'm a part of the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs team, I help in whatever capacity I'm available to help Bambi and Jamar out throughout the year. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Melanie. So next I'll introduce Kiara Beverly. Kiara, if you can on camera, hi. Kiara is a law student at LSU Law Center, and she is doing an externship this summer at with our office. And so she's been doing a lot of research on accessibility issues and other issues. I'm gonna let her talk a little bit about what she's doing, just a little bit because we only have a few minutes, but just kind of give an overview, and then everybody will have the expectations that we'll be able to solve all these problems. But we're really glad to have Kiara with us. She has a lot of experience in disability issues, and I'll go ahead and let you speak, Kiara. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so like Bambi said, I am a rising 2L at LSU Law. And so this summer I've had just an excellent opportunity to research accessibility and ADA compliance for the state. So I've had really great conversations with other representatives, ADA coordinators across the country, learning about what other states are doing so we can implement some of those things and new strategies to better comply with and enforce the ADA. I've had a great time just doing that research. I've learned so much, and it's also been really awesome to be a part of the conference. It was actually a bonus because I didn't think I was going to be able to be a part of it because of finals week, but I was glad I was able to help moderate a session yesterday and also tune in to today's voting session. So really grateful to be a part of the conference and having the opportunity to extern with the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs this summer.
Thanks, Kiara. Appreciate you. Well, Winifred will next introduce Winifred Sanders. She is also a law student doing an externship in our office, in the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs this summer. And I'll let her show her camera. Oh, there she comes. Okay. Um, so Winifred, we appreciate her working in our office this summer. She is a law student at Southern University Law Center, and she is a 3L. She has a lot of experience in disability issues as well, and she has been doing some research on disability issues, and I'm going to give her a moment to be able to introduce herself and share a little bit about the work she's doing.
Hi, I'm Winifred Sanders, and it's been a pleasure to extern with the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs this summer. As a student who has a disability, I have cerebral palsy, so being able to learn more and be able to help other individuals like myself who have disabilities, whether it be a physical disability or a developmental disability, has been very paramount to me, and that's something that I really want to focus on in my practice of law. And I'm also in the process of getting my human resource certificate. So any way that I could assist those individuals with disabilities is my goal in the future. And I value this opportunity, and I look forward to working with you all in the future in any endeavors in which I can help other individuals in this area.
Thanks, Winifred. Appreciate you. And last but certainly not least is Miss Lillian Dejean. And you all met Lillian yesterday. She was our keynote lunch speaker for the conference. Lillian has just graduated from high school. And I gave an introduction to her yesterday, and I failed to mention that you received an award this summer. That normally means that you go to the governor's mansion and have some type of meal there, but because of COVID, you weren't able to go. And what was that award, Lillian?
The LPB Young Heroes Award.
Young Heroes Award, that's right. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm.
So Lillian's interning in our office. I kind of went off track. Lillian's interning in our office, and I'm going to give her a few moments to be able to tell a little bit about herself, and also kind of one of her, how she wants to focus and some of her goals.
So, hi, I'm Lillian. I'm the new intern here at GODA, and also a self-advocate from Lafayette. I'm super passionate about disability history, culture, and youth advocacy specifically. I currently serve on the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council, and I'm super duper looking forward to working with and meeting more of our community. So thanks for the really kind introduction, Miss Bambi.
Oh, my phone. Thank you, Lillian. Appreciate it. So thanks to all of my staff and the people who work here that has made this successful. We're going to move into our last session of the conference, which is voting accessibility. And we're going Winifred will be facilitating that session. So you'll just give us a couple moments to get transitioned and we'll get started. Let's make sure our speakers are here. We have, let's see, Michelle and Jamie are both here. Winifred, whenever you're ready, you can introduce each one of them, Michelle and Jamie, and then I think Michelle has a PowerPoint. Michelle, if you want to share your PowerPoint after the introductions, you can get started with the session. So Winifred, I'll let you do the introductions.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have reached our pinnacle last session of our conference. It has been a great event that I feel like everyone has been able to garner and learn some information from. Our last session for the day is voting rights accessibility, and we have two keynote panelist speakers who will be presenting to us today, Miss Michelle Bishop and Miss Jamie Duplichin, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Ms. Bishop is the Disability Advocacy Specialist for voting rights at the National Disability Rights Network, where she is responsible for coordinating voting rights initiatives for every U.S. state, district, and territory, as well as she is providing ample training for and technical assistance for the NDRN nationwide network. And this organization allows voting accessibility to individuals with disabilities. She is also a part of the board of nonprofit rights, and she works in different areas across the United States. I'll let her go a little bit more in detail into her background. I don't want to take that thunder away from her. But we also have Miss Jamie Duplichin, who is a self-advocate and certified peer mentor through the Christopher and Diana Reeves Foundation and United Spinal Association. She's an active member of the Louisiana Statewide Independent Living Council, the honorary board member of the Brain Injury Association of Louisiana and the United Spinal Louisiana chapter, and a board member of the Consumer Advocacy Committee of Louisiana State University Human Development Center. At this time, I present to you all Miss Michelle Bishop and Jamie Duplichin.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Let's see, I do have a PowerPoint I was going to show you guys. So let's see if it will let me share it with y'all. It's being finicky with me. Oh, I see. Let's see. It is not. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, good. Whew. Okay. That made my computer freeze for a minute. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk you guys through it. And I can go ahead and share that with you all later. We've been having storms across Northern Virginia. And so my internet's a little finicky right now.
Michelle, this is Bambi. I could share it for you. It's always better for you to do it, but I can share it if
that'd be lovely if you could.
Okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yes, I'm so sorry. We've been having terrible storms every day. And so, oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, perfect. Thank you. I am grateful. So as you heard, my name is Michelle Bishop, and I'm the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at an organization called NDRN, or the National Disability Rights Network. We are a national membership association. Actually, I bet you that's in the slides. So I'm going to talk today about accessible elections and also a little bit about COVID-19, of course, and how that's impacting accessibility in, you know, just a minor little election you may have heard about happening in 2020, I'm sure. So can you take me to the next slide?
Is that it? Or did I go too far?
No, that's perfect. And I'm so sorry to make you click my slides. I appreciate it. So as I said, the National Disability Rights Network is a nonprofit membership association. We represent the federally mandated protection and advocacy, or P&A systems for individuals with disabilities. If you are not familiar with that whole network, your affiliate is actually Disability Rights Louisiana, and I bet you all know them very well. But my role at NDRN is to provide training and technical assistance to all of our organizations. There are 57. So just like Disability Rights Louisiana, there is a sister organization in all of the other states. We're in each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, each of the 5 territories, and the bonus 57th is actually the Native American Disability Law Center in the Southwest that represents Native Americans with disabilities. All right, let's move to the next slide. So let's jump right into it. I wanted to give you a little bit of that background. I'm joining you from the Washington, D.C. area today as our national point person that provides training and technical assistance to that network, but also works on elections accessibility from more of a national and a federal perspective. So I wanted to start with giving a little background on voters with disabilities and what we look like in the United States right now. People with disabilities are roughly 1 in 4 of Americans. I know the census puts us being a little bit less than that, but both the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Pew Research Center actually believe people with disabilities are more like 25% of the total population. There are, according to Rutgers University, over 35 million eligible voters with disabilities in the United States right now. If that sounds like a lot, that is a huge number. Over 35 million means that we are essentially 1 in 6 in the American electorate. We are 1/6 of the actual American electorate right now. Unfortunately, the bad news is that voter turnout among people with disabilities actually lags behind the general population at a rate of about 6%. Just 6%. That's a very small number. It may not sound that meaningful that our participation rates are only 6% behind, but when you think about all the eligible voters with disabilities in the United States, that 6% actually can equal about 3 million lost voters in any given election. Now, 3 million is a whole lot of voters. That's actually enough voters with disabilities probably to determine the outcome of any election that we've had in recent history, perhaps ever. So we're talking about a lot of voters, potential voters that we're losing here. So let's dig into why that might be happening. If you don't mind clicking me over to the next slide. All right, so first let's talk about the accessibility of elections. And we'll start with the current state of polling place access. The US Government Accountability Office actually studies the accessibility of polling places. Going back to 2000, they did surveys in 2000, 2008, 2016. They should be doing another study again this year for the 2020 general election. These have to be requested by Congress. So if you're noticing a theme here, they typically are requested every 4 to 8 years when there's usually a major presidential election happening. Next slide, please. So what are they finding in these studies? They're physically sending people out to survey polling places across the US. If we look first at the path of travel, which they consider from the parking area up to the actual voting booth itself, the rate of accessible polling places in 2000 was only 16%. Less than 20% of polling places could be considered fully accessible to people with disabilities in 2000. During the 2008 election, that number jumps up a little bit to 27%. And in the 2016 election, that number goes up to about 40%. Next slide. But in 2008, GAO also started looking at the accessibility of the voting stations themselves. In 2008, they found that the actual voting booth, about 54% of them, just over half, were considered fully accessible to people with disabilities. In 2016, that number actually drops down to about 35%. If we can go to the next slide. So what does that mean? What did they find when they were looking at voting stations? They found that they were less likely between 2016 and 2008 to be set up for the voter's privacy, set up so that other voters or personnel in the polling place could not see how that person with a disability was voting. It was also less likely to be set up for wheelchair accessibility. A common issue there when we set up voting booths for voter privacy is to have the interface with the wall behind you, right? So that the voters can't see, there's no one behind you, just that wall. The voters can't see who you're voting for. But if it's not positioned far enough out from that wall, for a person who's using a wheelchair to be able to roll into the space and turn to face the screen. Or if perhaps you have a tabletop machine that's set up on a table that doesn't have an accessible clearance underneath, but they were significantly less accessible for wheelchairs in 2016 versus 2008. Let's go to the next slide. And they also found that they were less likely to have the earphones out, that headset that should be out and readily apparent for any voter who needs to use an audio ballot. For instance, if I am someone who's blind or low vision and I need to be able to listen to my ballot and make my selections that way, those headphones were less likely to be out and ready for me to use. And the one that troubles me the most, voting systems are less likely to be powered on for use. There was about a 2% increase in voting machines that were present in the polling place, but they had not been turned on and set up by poll workers for voters with disabilities, or any voter for that matter, to be able to use them. Let's go to the next slide. So the bottom line in all of this that we find is that overall, pre-COVID-19, polling places are slowly becoming more accessible in terms of the location itself. We went from less than 20% to about 40% of polling places being considered architecturally accessible. They're compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, that's not great progress. That's really slow progress. And that means that the all-time high in 2016 was still less than half of our polling places being architecturally accessible to people with disabilities. So I would like it to be higher. I bet we all would. I would like progress to be quicker, but we're at least moving in the right direction. What we're finding is that voting stations are actually becoming less accessible over time. We are less likely to have enough stations to set them up properly for use, to set them up for the voters' privacy, and to make them fully accessible for voters with disabilities. When the Help America Vote Act first became law in 2002, there was a nationwide effort to make voting more accessible. Elections officials went out and purchased this equipment, and they were setting it up for use. And in many jurisdictions, every voter came in and used the accessible voting equipment, because if it works for people with disabilities, it works for everybody. Increasingly, we're finding that we're starting to segregate out how people vote, that people who don't have disabilities or who are otherwise capable of hand marking a paper ballot with a pen are given that option. And we have a limited number of accessible voting systems that are often kind of set up off in a corner, and you might have to ask to use it if you need it for accessibility purposes. And the more we make that a secondary method of voting, the less attention we're actually paying to making sure that we're maintaining that equipment, we're setting it up properly, and are retraining our poll workers on how to use it so that they can assist our voters. When you take all of this data together, in 2016, for the first time, GAO took that path of travel data and that voting station data and combined it. And they found that when you combine that data, only 17% of polling places could actually be considered fully accessible to people with disabilities. It knocks us right back down to that less than 20%. So why is our voter participation lagging? Are we administering our elections in a way that makes them work for all voters, including people with all types of disabilities? Let's go to the next slide. And then there was vote by mail, which we haven't even talked about yet in looking at all of this data. Vote by mail, absentee voting, whatever it is, in whatever state, traditional vote by mail is not accessible or compliant with federal law. Traditional absentee and vote by mail literally means that we put a paper ballot in the mail and we send it to a voter who we expect to be able to use a pen, a pencil, or a marker to mark it by hand. Now, you and I know if a voter with a disability can't do that for any reason in their polling place, if someone who is blind can't independently read that piece of paper and mark it, if someone who doesn't have use of their hands can't independently mark that piece of paper, they don't magically gain the ability to do that when they're sitting at their kitchen table. That paper ballot that's not accessible in the polling place is still inaccessible at the home. Vote by mail must be made accessible in addition to in-person voting under the law. This is something that the ADA is clear about. So if you're thinking that doesn't seem right, how is it not done accessibly? You're right. That is absolutely a violation of the law. It does need to be made accessible. It's essentially, until now, really been flying under the radar. Oh, I see a question here that I will answer real quick to prevent confusion. What is a voting station? Is it the voting machine? Yes, essentially the voting machine. The voting station is more of a catch-all term. It might be the accessible voting machine, or it could be simply a folding table where you sit down and you hand mark a ballot with a pen. It's essentially wherever the voter is marking their ballot, however they're doing that, since that varies from place to place. So one last thing I'll say about vote by mail as well, electronic balloting should be expanded. There are systems that allow for your vote by mail or absentee ballot to be sent to you electronically. You can log into an online portal and pull it up, or it can be emailed to you. And if you have the technology you need at home, a laptop with a screen reader or anything like that to be able to mark that ballot, you're able to do it that way rather than hand marking that ballot. In some cases, you can even return it electronically. And in some cases, you might have to print it out and mail back that piece of paper. These are systems that already exist. Every state is required to have them for their UOCAVA voters, which are essentially military and overseas voters. They're actually eligible to receive their ballots electronically already. So every state should already have a system like this that could be expanded for use, that would make vote by mail and absentee voting significantly more accessible and maybe help us close that voter turnout gap. Sorry, take us to the next slide.
I will. This is Bambi. We do have a way for people who have low vision. We have a law that was passed a few years ago for people with low vision that could vote electronically.
Perfect. I love it. I hope they will expand it to all voters. I think it benefits everybody to be able to do that, especially now that we're seeing issues with postal service. We saw in a lot of primaries in 2020 that ballots didn't get to the voter in time, who were waiting for it to arrive by mail, a problem they would not have had if they were able to receive it electronically. So I'm glad to hear that. I hope they'll keep expanding it. All right. So now that we've talked about the accessibility of elections overall, let's talk about what's happening with COVID-19, how elections are going in 2020. Everything I'm going to give you all from this point onward is something that actually exists in a public statement that NDRN has up on our website about elections and COVID-19. You can find it by going to ndrn.org, but I can also share it as well. I can email if that's something that you all would want to receive. So let's start by once again talking about in-person voting. One thing we know is that voting by mail does not work for everyone. We talked about how a lot of the vote by mail systems we have right now are not fully accessible for people with different types of disabilities, but also for people who live in extremely rural areas who don't have a traditional mailing address. It can also be extremely problematic. So we advocate for maintaining in-person voting to the greatest extent possible. Of course, we want those polling places to follow the CDC and other safety guidelines that are out there, right? We want to see people wearing masks, gloves, face shields. We want to see those plastic partitions in between poll workers and voters, using disposable pens if we have voters signing poll books or filling out ballots, disinfecting the accessible voting machine in between uses, all of those hand sanitizers, hand washing stations, all of those good practices that we know are going to make that polling place as safe as possible. But we do want to see in-person voting maintained. Let's go to the next slide. We also understand that there are not going to be enough polling places in 2020. It's very unlikely. In part of that is for very good reason. Polling places, you know, are voluntary. They're not required to serve. And there are some that we agree should not serve as polling places in 2020. If it's common that you're using residential facilities, nursing homes, places like that, these typically make great polling places because they're more likely to be ADA compliant, and it makes voting really easy for the folks that live there who don't have to do an absentee ballot or try to get transportation to the polling place. They can just go downstairs. Right now, those facilities have a very real obligation to protect their residents, and if they're unwilling to open their doors and let in the general public for voting, I would absolutely support them in that. So we know that there's going to be a polling place shortage. The thing I want to stress despite that is polling locations are required to be ADA compliant no matter what. So even with a limited number of polling places, we got to try to pick our rock star accessible locations and make them work. Let's go to the next slide. Of course, if the polling places may be moved, we want to look at maintaining proximity to previous locations as much as possible and transit options whenever possible. We don't want polling places, if they have to be moved, to move too far where they're difficult to get to or away from public transit, which is going to make them significantly harder for some voters to get to. We also should really be looking at leveraging temporary modifications to polling places. I think this is going to be really critical if we have to use some less than ideal locations that may not be fully accessible, that we're doing some of the really simple things we can do, using traffic cones to create temporary accessible parking spaces, propping open doors, taping down cords, putting down portable ramps, any of those easy, some putting a traffic cone under a water fountain that's not cane detectable, any of those really simple, easy same-day modifications that are going to make a polling place a little more workable. One of the things I worry about is that some of our elections officials are really well versed in what some of those easy modifications are, and some less so, because this isn't necessarily their world. Trust me, they've got enough. I know that they have enough to know in terms of running elections without being an expert in the ADA as well. We're also encouraging curbside voting to be allowed everywhere, even in places where it's not traditionally used. Some states have curbside voting all the time. Some explicitly don't allow curbside voting. We want to see it everywhere because we know we may be using less than ideal locations. We also know for some people with disabilities, limiting your exposure to COVID-19 is going to be the #1 factor in how you cast your ballot. For someone who's immunocompromised, that may be the most important thing. In some places, curbside voting, they don't use accessible voting machines that are capable of being brought to the car, and that person may have to hand mark a paper ballot. But for someone who's immunocompromised, who's capable of hand marking that ballot, who needs to limit their exposure, being able to stay inside their vehicle and have just one poll worker with PPE come to them might be the safest thing. So that's something we're really thinking about and really advocating for as well. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's talk about remote voting, which is your absentee or your vote by mail. One of the things that we're advocating for is to, in 2020, allow all voters to use absentee, vote by mail, whatever remote voting options are available in the state, without excuses. Or if an excuse is required, COVID-19 should be excuse enough. We need to keep our polling places safe. And the primary way to do that is to not have congestion at the polls. If more people opt to vote from home, fewer people will be at the polls and we can socially distance them. So let's open that process up. We want to see deadlines extended as much as possible, just to make it easier for people to apply or to return that ballot, so vote by mail is an option for them. We'd also like to drop requirements for things like witness signatures and notaries. Some of those things are enough of a barrier, honestly, under more ideal conditions. But in terms of COVID-19, anyone who's self-isolating for very good reason shouldn't have to access a witness or a notary to be able to use that vote from home option. So these are things that can be done either through a state election official or through an act of the state legislature. These adaptations can be made, and we've seen it happen in some places. And we think that that really makes it possible for a lot more people to vote from home. Let's go to the next slide. So just a little bit more about remote voting. We also are advocating for providing those absentee ballots with a self-sealing prepaid envelope so that anyone who's receiving a paper ballot, marking it and mailing it back, the envelope is there, the postage is there. There's nothing else that they need to get. They can put it together, drop it in a drop box, put it in a mailbox. Including myself, some people just don't own stamps. It is an actual barrier. And there's also a cost to acquiring those stamps if you need to get them. And we're not really supposed to have any processes that add extra cost when it comes to voting. We're also advocating that you include accessibility information in the ballot package so that if there is, like you said, an option for accessing your ballot electronically, every voter has access to that information. I know putting it in a paper mailer is not accessible to everybody. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then establishing additional drop sites for completed absentee ballots, having as many places as possible where you can take them, secured locations where you can drop them, ideally where you may not have to interact with another person, since we know that's the primary method of transmission for COVID-19. All right, let's go to the next slide. I think I'm almost done, y'all. I'll wrap up for you soon. Oh, I was right. All right, so more information. Here's a link right here where you can find our statement that provides a lot more detail. Of course, I also had to give a shout out to Disability Rights Louisiana, who could be your go-to resource on these issues. every member of our network is mandated by the Help America Vote Act to work on access to the vote for people with disabilities. There are absolutely people at Disability Rights Louisiana who know their stuff, who would love to talk to you about this more. But I also put my contact information in there as well. You're more than welcome to contact me, of course. And then I think I've got one more slide for you. Yes, here it is. This is my 2020 election plan. All voters are different. You all know every type of disability is different and experiences different barriers. Even two people who have the same disability don't experience it in the same way. But even voters who don't have disabilities are all different, and what works best for us varies. So I believe in a give them everything but the kitchen sink model of running elections. Let's have in-person voting with a walk-up option and a drive-up option. Let's have vote by mail that includes a paper ballot and an electronically delivered ballot. Let's have every option we can think of. I'd love to see early voting and extended hours to reduce congestion, all those things, so that we can make this work for as many voters as possible. But the last thing I want to stress, we always want to see a robust voter education and notification plan that includes multiple accessible formats. There are so many changes happening to how we run our elections, and they are happening so very quickly that we really have to be able to let voters know what's going on. It cuts down on the confusion and the intimidation, and it makes sure they know what their accessibility options are. So we really want to see, mail notifications going out, but elections officials also typically have email addresses and cell phone numbers that they can use to email and text alerts. They can be in the local newspaper, on the television news, on the radio, providing this information on their websites, on their social media, every format we can possibly think of to make sure voters are getting notifications, and they're getting those notifications in a way that's going to be accessible to them. So that's everything that I had for you all today. That's a really broad overview of kind of all of our recommendations. I hope that's helpful, but I'm happy to answer questions when we're done as well. So if you're thinking, I really wanted something a little bit different from this presentation, can you talk about such and such issue? I would absolutely love to. And of course, thank you so much for getting my PowerPoint up and saving me there. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We'll now have Ms. Jamie Duplichin, and then at the end, we'll answer questions that the attendees have for both of you guys, if you don't mind waiting until the end. You're muted, Ms. Duplichin.
Okay, hello. So today I'm going to introduce the Rev Up campaign in Rev Up Louisiana to you guys. The Rev Up campaign was started by the American Association of People with Disabilities, and it's a network of local, state, and national coalitions together providing necessary information. Give me 1 second, guys. Close window. Microphone off. Okay. And we provide necessary information to increase the political power of the disability community while also engaging candidates and the media on disability issues. Through Louisiana Statewide Independent Living Council, we have initiated Rev Up Louisiana to partner with them and help make the disability vote count here in Louisiana. Rev Up stands for register, educate, vote, use your power. The purpose of Rev Up is to, of course, increase the political power of the disability community. We want to educate voters about issues and candidates. We want to promote the turnout of voters with disabilities across the state. We want to engage our candidates and the media on the issues that are affecting the disability community. And we want to protect voters' rights to participate in elections. As I mentioned previously, RevUp stands for register, educate, vote, use your power. And I'll start by giving you some information on our first step, which is to get registered. Louisiana does have a disability program, which, well, it's for individuals who wish to vote but have a disability requiring either assistance or making it impossible for the individual to appear in person and vote either early or on election day. In order to be eligible for this program, you must have a physical disability or not be able to appear in person to vote either early or on election day. Due to being homebound, and senior citizens who are 65 or older and who have previously voted in the parish they are applying in are eligible for the program. You must show proof of disability, which would be a form filled out by your physician, an ID. And you can get all of this information on the govote.com page, which is GEAUXVOTE.com. The benefits that come with eligibility for the disability program include the automatic absentee by mail ballot process, the opportunity to vote in person at a nursing or veterans home if you are a resident, assistance for the individual voter who chooses to vote in person instead of using the automatic absentee by mail ballot. So now I'm going to go into the next step, which I find is one of the most important steps, and that is to educate. Education is very important. We, as voting individuals, must educate ourselves on the candidates and what they support. But we must also educate our candidates on the issues that most affect us. Before I got really involved in the advocacy world, I would have never dreamed of picking up the phone and calling a legislator and planning to meet with them about anything. I didn't want to get involved in any type of politics. But once I got involved, I realized that they are here to serve the people of the state, and they want to know. It's very important to educate them because they don't know everything. And we get upset because things aren't going our way, but a lot of times it's because they may not know what our needs may be throughout the disability community. And so it's up to us to say, hey, this is an issue and it's not only affected me, but we need to discuss it. And they are happy to. They're even happy to have lunch or a cup of coffee with you. And then, of course, now that we're registered to vote and we educated ourselves and our candidates on the issues that affect us, we must get out there and vote. Like Justin Dart said, we must vote like our life depends on it, because it does. Some of the websites that you can go to educate yourself on different candidates would be the Go Vote page, which is GEAUXVOTE.com, ballotpedia.com, BALLOTPEDIA.com, politics1.com, POLITICS1.com, opensecrets.org. And if there's an election about different policies, there's actually a website you can go to that will explain to you what happens if that policy is passed or not. And that is the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana, and it is parlouisiana.org. Any questions?
Winifred, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. I was trying to pull the questions back up.
Okay.
Wallace Johnson asked, is there a curbside voting option in the state of Louisiana to the best of your knowledge? If either one of you know the answer to that question.
I don't believe there is actually right now. And if someone knows otherwise, definitely say so. I don't believe that there is. I know that there are groups advocating in Louisiana who are asking for it. I did actually quickly check on the website for your state elections officials, and I didn't find anything that indicated that that's an option in the section that talks about accommodations for voters with disabilities, which is probably not a good sign, so I don't believe there is. Interestingly enough, there's a couple things on that website that actually look like they violate federal law, but I can follow up with someone about that separately. There's some limitations on having to prove that you have a disability if you are going to have someone assist you to vote, and some additional restrictions on who that assistant can be that look like they actually violate the Voting Rights Act.
Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, I was good.
Also, shout out to Rev Up. We are also a part of Rev Up at the national level. So I was so excited to hear that's what you were talking about today.
And this is Bambi. I don't think, Michelle, what you're talking about having to prove that you have a disability, it seems like I've seen that. But I assist my son in voting, and I've never had to prove that he had a disability. I have to sign a paper saying who assisted him when you go vote, but I haven't had to show any proof of him having a disability.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe that some register of voters or polling places just adhere to it in different ways. But it is problematic if the language says that you might be having some issues at some polling places.
Right.
So.
Right.
It does say it on the Go Vote page, baby.
Yeah. Just some. I know they've never made us do it, so
Right.
they may not.
I don't think I've ever had to prove it either, but I don't remember if when I did register, if I registered as an individual with a disability, so I don't know.
One of the other things I noticed on the website as well is that it also had restrictions on who can assist you, and your employer or your union rep, that's federal law, they can assist you, but staff of a residential facility should be able to assist you. And that's listed as someone who's restricted. That looks like it goes a little further than federal law. Just tossing that out there. Sorry, a little off topic.
I just think there's a lot of issues that need to be tended to.
Always. Elections are a very messy business.
So it sounds like, Michelle, you're giving us some ideas of some laws we need to change. You're listening, Jamie?
I sure was. Bambi, it's been on my mind. I've been really fussing about this. I've been real heated when I've been doing my research for Rev Up, let me tell you. I'm like, so they're giving us instructions to let us know how they're going to violate our rights as voters. Great.
I have a question.
Sure.
In the midst of COVID-19 and the way that the different, parameters are being put in place in regards to a lot of states still remaining in like phase 1 or going into phase 2, do you feel that the voting accessibility is going to, in a sense, be taken into consideration or evolved in some of those states that will have to remain in phase 1, maybe into the election season?
That's going to be a very tricky question. In the primaries, when we were under more significant shutdown orders, you have the ability to delay your primary and to essentially push it back, which some states did by a few months. When it comes to the general election, there's only so long you can push back the general election before you're essentially going to be violating the Constitution. I think it could be pushed back maybe by like 2 weeks before it becomes a significant issue. So the general election will have to just go ahead, no matter what those shutdown orders look like. And I don't know what we do when we end up in that position. One of the things that worries me about that is that a lot of elections offices don't have the capacity to process everyone voting by mail. They literally don't necessarily have enough staff to receive all those applications and process them and get you your ballot in time, and then get all those ballots back and get them processed. Simply because we're expecting record numbers of people voting by mail. They don't usually have to process that many. So I don't know if I have a great answer to that question. We're heading into a little bit of an unknown. I think initially, even a couple months ago, it looked like maybe we were going to have the COVID-19 under better control. And we're positioning ourselves well for November, but we're seeing those numbers go up again. And we're looking at states potentially rolling back some of that reopening. So we are heading into a bit of an unknown. I think some of those questions will be answered within the next couple months. That's one of the things I really worry about, though, is voters have to know what's coming, and they have to know what their options are and what's going on. Those last minute decisions, those last minute changes are just chaos for voters. So some of that are things that are outside of our control, but making sure voters know what their options are and that the accessibility there is being respected is something that I think we can really advocate for. Because the COVID numbers are going up in so many places, including, I'm coming to you from Virginia, our numbers are going up. I think that's why those remote voting options have to be as accessible as possible. And I want to stress, even receiving your mail-in ballot electronically isn't necessarily fully accessible if you're required to print it out and mail it back. Just not everyone can do that. If I don't have use of my hands, I might be able to mark it on my computer, but what am I going to do with that paper when it comes on my printer? Well, first of all, not everyone owns a printer. I don't own a printer. Mostly because I feel like printers, the ink is dried up whenever you need to print something, right? I don't.
Or you're out.
Or then I just have to order more toner, right? I usually print things when I'm out in the world, which I used to do, right? I used to go to work. So not everyone has the capacity to do that, but that's really not fully accessible unless you can receive it electronically, mark it electronically, return it electronically. It's really not passing all the accessibility tests there. It also worries me when we do those things on the fly because not everyone has all that technology at home. Not everyone has a computer and a tablet and internet service or cellular data service or whatever it is that they need at home to be able to access that. If we really had planned well in advance for making those remote voting options much more accessible, we might have fixed some of those issues by now. But it wasn't something that was really always prioritized going forward. So we're going to learn a lot heading into this election. If that sounds worrisome,
it does.
I'm worried too. I'm worried too.
It's very worrisome to think about the fact that there are not a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that we have. And the fact that in your presentation, you talked about so many individuals with disabilities who are not being able to vote, and that we're losing those votes in the election. And those are key determinative votes, and those people still have a right to voice their opinion and who they want to vote for. But because of the lack of voting accessibility, we're missing out on that.
I agree. I mean, I would say one thing, don't lose hope. In the primaries, a lot of primary elections were not ready for this. And we saw voters turn out anyway, right? Wisconsin wasn't ready. Wisconsin was like the test case for, are we ready to have in-person voting during COVID-19? And they ended up with lines of voters that were several city blocks long, because they were trying to socially distance them. But that's because those people wanted to vote, right? They turned out anyway. So I think, 2020 is showing us the vulnerabilities and how we run our elections and the accessibility of our elections, but it's also showing us that voters want to have their voices heard. So I think I really take heart in that, and that's kind of keeping me going this year. And I think we can generate that among people with disabilities. Like, yes, there are barriers. There shouldn't be, right? It's wrong that it's not fully accessible. It's wrong that you have to get over these barriers. It's wrong you have to go and advocate for yourself when you go to vote. That's not supposed to happen. But we still need you to cast that ballot, right? We got to have our voices heard if we want to create positive change. So like, you just can't let it stop you, right? There's barriers, but I vote anyway. And I think if we can instill some of that in our community for people with disabilities, like, I think we can, let's go for lack of a better term, let's get them revved up, right? Let's get them revved up to use their power.
Miss Kathy Dwyer said you have to register in advance of voting if you need assistance, and that's on the SOS website. So if anybody would,
well, I'm sorry, Winifred, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, you're fine. Go ahead.
It does say that on the Secretary of State, but it also says that if you go the day of early voting or on the election day and you do need assistance, there should be a form that you can ask for and fill out. Now, it doesn't state that you would have to bring anything with you, but and like Ms. Bambi said, you know, most places hasn't required her to prove disability. But if you haven't done it prior to that day, I would just bring something that shows some proof of disability, just in case that particular polling place, I was asking for it. And they should have a form for assistance for you to fill out so you are able to vote on that day.
Okay, and just for clarification, you have to fill out the form prior to receiving the assistance?
Well, so it says on the website that you're supposed to apply that like in advance for assistance when voting. However, it does also say that if you do show up and you haven't done that, they do have a form for assistance for you to fill out there, and you should be able to vote on that day that you're there.
Thank you. I feel like that's really good information for not only myself, but any other attendees who are listening, so that they can get that information to not only for themselves, for other individuals they may know who are preparing to go out and vote in this upcoming election. Ma'am?
Oh no, I was just seeing the comment that Miss Kathy had said after that, and about her polling place wouldn't let an elderly husband assist his elderly wife. And so when things like that arise, it's important to call Disability Rights of Louisiana, because they will get on it right away. So if there's any violations that you see at any given time, pick up your phone and call Disability Rights of Louisiana, because they will tend to it right away.
Yes, agree completely. And don't ever forfeit your right to vote. Don't ever forfeit your right to vote. You know, call Disability Rights Louisiana, they will help advocate for you. But no, that was wrong. That husband should have been able to assist his wife for sure. It's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That actually guarantees the right to the assistant of your choice if you are a person with a disability or a person with limited English proficiency. The only known exceptions to that, your employer and your union rep cannot assist you to vote. Other than that, who can assist you should not be limited. You should not have to register in advance. You should not have to prove that you have a disability. Any of those extra trappings are in addition to what your protections are under the Voting Rights Act. And that's something that could legally be challenged, because the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would absolutely trump any of that. And that is the famous piece of civil rights legislation for which Congressman John Lewis was almost murdered on Bloody Sunday, marching in Alabama to have passed. And that provides us that right. So that's something that could be challenged, but as an individual voter, definitely call Disability Rights Louisiana for sure.
And Miss Andrea Lowe said that we have to be careful not to violate the law in regards to the civil rights law in regards to voting. Asking whether a person has a disability can be an issue.
I agree. I always say, I talk a lot to elections officials, and I always tell them you don't want to be in a position where your poll workers are trying to make a decision about who they think is, and I say this in quotes, disabled enough to receive accommodations or to use the accessible machine or any of that. All of that is something that, first of all, as an elections official, opens you up to being sued, quite frankly, right? Because if they make some bad choices, that ends up in the newspaper and that ends up in court. So no, they absolutely do not want to be in that place. If someone says that they need someone to assist them to vote, then let someone assist them to vote. That is really their business. So yeah, I agree completely.
Well, we thank you guys for being able to come in and join us for this panel discussion and talk about your skill and your knowledge in the voting rights accessibility area. I really do appreciate it on behalf of the Governor's Office of Disability Affairs. And if anyone else has any further questions, we will be able to get their contact information for you guys. But at this time, I'll turn it back over to Ms. Bamby.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank y'all. Appreciate it. Thank you, Winifred, for facilitating that session. So this is it, everyone. We really appreciate everyone who's been involved in the conference through participation, our great panelists who have just shared their knowledge. Also would like to thank Landon and Sylvie, who are our interpreters. You have seen them throughout the entire session. And Lindsay, who is our captionist, who you have not seen, but that's her words across the screen. Thank you again to my staff, and just y'all have a great weekend. Remember, be safe. Our numbers for COVID are going up. Unfortunately, our hospitalization and death rates are going up. And so we really just need to make sure everyone is practicing social distancing and wearing a mask. And I know the people who are listening right now, I'm preaching to the choir because you know that, but we appreciate all that you do in your advocacy. And y'all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.